Hello, everyone. This has been a long time coming, I think, but we finally made it. The launch event for our own Carlos Garrido is, in my opinion, absolutely groundbreaking new book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. We've got some amazing people here with us without whom this event would not be happening. But before we get to that, I want to say a few words about the necessity of understanding the purity fetish and why that book is so important. So let's get started.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
We seem to be entering a period of great change in America. Over half of our population struggles paycheck to paycheck. Finance capital is fully consolidated and become really the primary mode of capital accumulation within our ruling class. And this is felt all over the working classes. The middle class American dream is effectively dead in the 2020s, and our standards of living are deteriorating at a rate we haven't ever seen before. But it isn't all doom and gloom. This reproletarianization is forcing people all over the country, all over the world really, to wake up from that dream and look around and realize that it just isn't possible to continue on in the old way anymore. Something's got to give. Something's got to change. And this is where we seem to hit a snag. The ideological problems of the left that we get smacked in the proverbial face with when we begin trying to organize and trying to work to fix things. I don't think I have to tell anyone here what a mess a lot of the modern so-called left is. The purity fetish, its analysis, and its central position in the formation of American Marxism, grounded in our own revolutionary history, passed to us from people like Du Bois and Winston, Foster, MLK, and so many others. This is an antidote to the ideological problems rampant on the left. It was an absolute honor to be able to edit this book. And before we begin, I just want to say that I'm incredibly proud to call Carlos not just a brilliant and fearless comrade, but a good friend. So with all that out of the way, let's get to what everybody really came here for. Eddie?
Yes, thanks, Noah. And first of all, before we get into it, I'd like to thank Noah for helping to organize this event and for everything that he does for our project here at Midwestern Marx. Behind the scenes, without Noah, organizing an event of this scale would have been absolutely impossible. So thank you, Noah. And thanks also to our amazing guests for being here today. We encourage the audience to check out their organizations after this book launch, as they're all doing amazing work. Professor Gabriel Rockhill's Critical Theory Workshop has been putting out great analyses of what they call the global theory industry, looking at the production of political and economic theory, as well as their sources of funding, which has been really enlightening stuff and informative for us here at Midwestern Marx. We also have Radhika Desai and Alan Freeman with us, who have been organizing an alliance for socialism and against capitalist imperialism with their International Manifesto group. You can go to their website right now and sign their manifesto, urging people to struggle against the new Cold War foreign policy of the Western imperialists. So we're extremely grateful to have such knowledgeable and well-respected academics and comrades with us here today to launch this book, and we look forward to more collaboration with them in the future. So again, be sure to follow their websites and their social media for more fantastic information, which all helps to inform our world outlook here at Midwestern Marx.
Awesome. Our first speaker is Thomas Riggins. Thomas is a retired philosophy teacher from NYU, the New School of Social Research, and others. Received a PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center in '83, and he's consulting editor for the Midwestern Marx Institute. He's been active in the civil rights and peace movement since the 1960s, when he was chairman of the Young People's Socialist League at Florida State University. And he also worked for CORE in voter registration in North Florida. He has written for many online publications like People's World and Political Affairs, where he was an associate editor. He also served on the board of the Bertrand Russell Society and was president of the Corliss Lamont chapter in New York City of the American Humanist Association. He's the author of Reading the Classical Texts of Marxism and Eurocommunism, a critical reading of Santiago Carrillo and Eurocommunist revisionism. Here's Thomas.
Well, going to introduce this book in the spirit of our comrades from the Middle Flowery Kingdom. I have the 5 takeaways that we need to have from this book. I should reformulate that as the Middle Flowery People's Republic. The 5 takeaways for the Purity Fetish. After you've heard the other speakers and I've had a chance to read the book, these are the 5 most important things I think that you'll have to remember. One is we have to take away the idea that those Marxists that refuse to accept the reality of the states and peoples who are struggling to institute socialism, to build Marxism in their countries, that have faced failures and are unable to make mistakes, that this does not mean that they're supposed to be rejected and denounced as traitors to Marxism because they're not living completely according to some ideal idea of what Marxism and socialism is supposed to look like. The real world is very different from the ideal world, as we learned from reading Hegel. It's one thing to say all men are created equal. It takes a civil war to make it begin to happen. The second takeaway is those people who dismiss certain elements of the working class in this country, especially in this country, but other countries too, because they are backwards in their thinking, reactionary thinking, they have racist ideas, whatever the problems are that make these people hostile to us or hostile to progressivism. Instead of blaming them, we should remember it's the system that's creating these people. And our job is to educate them and try to free them from the shackles that have been put on them by the capitalist system, instead of denouncing them as deplorables and useless and trying to ignore them. That's the second thing that Carlos, one of the 5 things that Carlos puts forth in that book. That's the second takeaway I think we have to make. The third takeaway we have to do is fight back against dumping on China from the left. This seems to be something that is incorrigible in the press now because of the Cold War starting up with China again. Academic leftists and the petty bourgeois leftists that claim to be Marxists want to attack China, call China capitalist because it has to go through these reforms to try to improve the living standards of their people. We all know the struggles that are going on in China. And so we have to fight back and it's not our job to defend China, but it's our job to explain to people the reality of what the Chinese struggle is, and that that's a form of defense. But I don't want to be labeled as defender of the Chinese, but at least explainer of what's going on there and why we should support the Chinese and support the Chinese government in its efforts to increase the living standards, not only the Chinese, but to bring about a more peaceful world to live in, and to bring about real foreign aid to the peoples of Africa and South America, instead of the phony type of foreign aid the United States insists on giving that requires them to vote the way we tell them to in the United Nations. The fourth takeaway is the people who ignore the progressive history of the United States. The people who want to dump Lincoln statues are being tossed away now in some ultra-left groups. It's true that our country has a checkered past with the Indian removals and with racism and with slavery, Nevertheless, there were people back in those days that fought against that, even though they didn't have the advanced positions of the 21st century. They knew slavery was wrong. They tried to do something to eliminate slavery. They may have been caught up in the system themselves because they were economically in the plantation system. But we have to remember that just to try to dump on all American progressive history because of the weaknesses of the past is alienating from people, regular Americans today, who have some feeling of patriotic pride in their country. It's true, the Communist Manifesto says the working people have no country. We can't forget that we are actually internationalists, but we can tell them they do have a country. It's not as great as Trump cracks it up to be, but it's not as bad as people who think that we're all colonial settlers and something. We have to give everything back to the original inhabitants. Okay, that's the fourth thing. And the last thing is the left is soft on the anti-imperialism front. There's too many people on the left who are also flying Ukrainian flags in their backyard or on porches. And we have to remember that any struggle against the major enemy of the world's people, which is U.S. imperialism, by far the most bloodthirsty killing machine since World War II, just the number of Vietnamese they killed and the number of North Koreans that were bombed out far exceeds anything any left group or any left country has done as a communist country or as a socialist country, or even as a bourgeois country. I'm talking about Russia, which is abandoned communism, but nevertheless plays a progressive role against U.S. imperialism. Then that's the common enemy of humanity right now. And they should be getting, at least we should be supporting them, if not outright cheering. We should at least be supporting their right to defend themselves from NATO and the use of other countries like Ukraine as puppets and proxy wars against them. If we read Carlos's book and see that the purity fetish, or those Marxists or people who claim to be Marxists, who in the name of trying to be true Marxists don't accept any of those 5 takeaways that I put out, do we understand that these people are, whatever their good intentions are, we on the left and in the Communist Party at least had a distinction between objective and subjective enemies. And they may be subjectively communists and friends, but they are objectively helping U.S. imperialism. And I think reading Carlos's book will make anybody who's not aware of that aware of that. And this book is a big advance in the struggle here in the United States.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was brilliant. Our next speaker is going to be Radhika Desai from the International Manifesto Group and a lot of other stuff. Dr. Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies and director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. She's proposed a new historical materialist approach to understanding world affairs and geopolitical economy based on the materiality of nations. Some of her recent books are Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, and Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy, which is quickly becoming my favorite as I make my way through it, by the way. Her articles and book chapters appear in international scholarly journals and edited volumes. She co-edits the Geopolitical Economy from Manchester University Press and the Future of Capitalism book series from Pluto Press, along with Alan Freeman. Radhika?
Thank you so much, Noah.
Oh, you're muted, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Noah. And I have to say, it's a great privilege to be part of this book launch, chiefly because I think this is a critically important book. I think it's critically important for all on the left, particularly in the English-speaking countries, to read it. And it is actually very clear and very short, and that's also a big advantage. I think particularly important is its focus on dialectics, which is much maligned and misunderstood in the English-speaking world. I remember my own teachers who taught me Marxism dismissing a lot of what is dialectics as Hegelian mystical fog. what you find in Carlos's book is a very clear discussion of dialectics, why it matters very, very practically today. In the few minutes I have, I want to liken Carlos's discussion of the purity fetish, the inability of the Western left to give up its juvenile longing for some sort of pure socialism and embrace socialism in its inevitably soiled reality, its inevitably soiled, earthy reality. And I want to liken this to Marx's discussion of the fetish character of commodities. Carlos argues at the close of his introduction, and I'll be quoting Carlos a lot and I'll be quoting Marx a lot. So, Carlos argues at the close of his introduction that what can help overcome Western Marxism's purity fetish, its inability to come to terms with the reality of real struggles for socialism, the real working class, etc., and the realities of American history, is not simply, as Losurdo argues, learning to build a bridge between different temporalities found in Marx's notion of communism. That is, on the one hand, a utopian remote future where society inscribes on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, and the actual future where communism is described as the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. And I just like to underline that actually practically no one I know fully understands what the real movement is when Marx refers to it and why it's important. So I think Carlos's book is very important for that. So what Carlos is saying here is that the intellectual move, the intellectual understanding of what is wrong is not enough. Just as the intellectual recognition of the source of value is not enough to banish the fetish character of commodities, the mystical character that attaches itself to the commodity thanks to its social form, a social form in which the equality of the kinds of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by its duration takes on the form of the magnitude of value of the products of labor. And finally, the relationships between producers within which the social characteristics of labor are manifested take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. This is me quoting Marx. Marx is what Marx describes as the fetishism of commodities. And his point is it inheres in the social relationships. This social significance of commodities as something above and beyond simple use values has been hard for political economy to grasp, and it continued to dog comprehensions of capitalism and the dynamics of its basic cell, the commodity, and this continues up to the present day. And Marx says, just like Carlos, mere comprehension, however, of this reality is not going to be enough to remove the mysticism and replace it with clarity. That clarity can only be achieved by a clarification, that is to say, a transformation of the social relations. And I'm quoting Marx again here. The belated scientific discovery that the products of labor, insofar as they are values, are merely the material expressions of the human labor expended to produce them, marks an epoch in the history of mankind's development. But, he emphasizes, by no means banishes the semblance of objectivity possessed by the social characteristics of labor. Something which is only valid in this particular form of production appears to those who are caught in these relations of commodity production, namely ourselves who live in capitalist societies. It appears to them to be just as ultimately valid as the fact that the scientific dissection of the air into its component parts left the atmosphere itself unaltered in its physical configuration. So Marx is saying that just intellectually comprehending this is not going to remove the mystical character of commodities, the fetish character of commodities. The reason is that the appearance arises spontaneously, not from thought, but from practice. And again, Marx says, Men do not, therefore, bring the products of their labor in relation with each other as values because they see these objects merely as material integuments of homogeneous human labor. The reverse is true. By equating their products to each other in exchange as values, they equate different kinds of labor as human labor. That is to say, this equation is made in our practices. And as long as those practices continue, that impression will always linger. It will always be difficult to see through that. So this means, again, in Marx's word, that the veil of the mystical character is not removed from the countenance of the social life processes, that is the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men and stands under their conscious and planned control. The mystical character of commodities will only be removed, Marx is saying, when we transform those relations that give rise to it, which is we transform capitalist relations of production into socialist relations of production in which we consciously plan and control the larger productive economy. So to continue with Marx, this, however, Marx says, requires that society possesses a material foundation or a series of material conditions of existence, which in their turn are the natural and spontaneous product of a long and tormented historical development, which here, and finish quoting Marx, Marx is basically saying that this situation of socialism will only arise as a result of a long and tortuous development, which is exactly what Carlos is referring to when he says that the purity fetish does not permit a recognition of real advances towards socialism. So Carlos's argument in the purity fetish is very similar. The purity fetish, Carlos says, cannot be removed by mere intellectual advances. It requires the emergence of a different kind of left. Only then the purity fetish will go away. And Carlos says, although this is important, that is to say, the intellectual understanding is important, a more accurate cure is for Western Marxism to reflect on the objective conditions which drive its purity fetish. And once self-conscious of these, move towards changing these objective conditions. And this he puts into bracket, although I think this is actually the most important part, which means moving away from a professional managerial class dominated left towards a working class centered left, free of the dominant influence of the professional managerial class iron triangle of institutions and culture. So in a sense, Carlos's argument is that the purity fetish is rooted in the division, the separation of intellectual and manual labor, which in late capitalism has developed into a veritable class divide, which is also, by the way, a national divide in which the intellectual and manual elements of the working class occupy not just different parts of cities, but also often different countries. And that is why, of course, the struggle for socialism must always be anti-imperialist. So what Carlos is saying is that unless we move on from this sort of PMC-dominated left, the professional managerial class-dominated left, towards a left that is connected with the real struggles of working people worldwide, we will not be free of the purity fetish. So we must read Carlos's book not just as an attempt to take us intellectually beyond the purity fetish, but also as a call to create an absolutely different kind of left, the kind of left that Marx and Engels originally tried to build when they first came into contact with working people and set about trying to create an international organization of working people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely brilliant. Our next speaker is going to be Eddie Liger Smith, our very own Eddie Liger Smith. Eddie's an American political scientist and specialist in anti-imperialist and socialist projects, especially Venezuela and Cuba. Or I'm sorry, China. He's both an editor and
China and Venezuela. Sorry. Just wanted to be clear.
Yes, I apologize. He's
No
both an
worries.
editor and political economy analyst at the Midwestern Marx Institute. He's also research interest in the role Southern slavery played in the development of American and European capitalism and the American healthcare system. His most recent work can be found on the Midwestern Marx Institute website and in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, Volume 2. Go ahead whenever you're ready, Eddie.
Sounds good. Actually, I had a little bit of a technical difficulty here with my Word document. I just closed it, so bear with me here as I pull that up. But really honored to be here with such amazing speakers and so many people that I look up to and have helped inform my own world outlook. So I'll do my best here to follow that great presentation from Professor Desai. So hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Liger Smith. I co-founded Midwestern Marx with Carlos after the Bernie campaign ended in 2020. Also, when Carlos and I were graduating our undergraduate degree or getting our undergraduate degrees together. And I got involved with socialist organizing when I was in high school after Wisconsin's Governor Scott Walker busted up the teachers' unions while claiming that the teachers were greedily driving up the state debt with their massive salaries. So Governor Walker then turned around after cutting the teachers' salaries to fix the debt and gave a multi-million-dollar government subsidy to this multinational corporation called Foxconn that had donated a lot of money to his campaign, which further drove up Wisconsin's state debt that currently stands at well over $20 billion. So the debt has not been fixed as Walker promised, although my working class teacher father has at least $5,000 less in his salary each year. So after that experience and after learning about Bernie Sanders and doing some research into Scott Walker and finding that he was an utter puppet of the Koch brothers and other oligarchs, I sent myself on a mission basically to overthrow these corrupt politicians, or at least expose them to the people, and create a government or an economy that actually serves the working people in this country, people like my mom and dad. And not people like the shareholders at these multinational corporations. So after leaving for college in 2016, which is where I would meet Carlos, I decided to major in politics. And in 2020, I threw myself, along with Carlos, into the Bernie campaign and groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, who seemed like the best option to reform or revolutionize our system. And since that time, since joining the left, to put it frankly, I've often found myself wondering what the heck is wrong with the American left. How do we live in a society where the corruption of politicians like Scott Walker is so blatant, where the congressional approval rating sits around 17%, and yet remain unable to organize a mass movement of working people against these corrupt politicians and their donors? So the answer to my question of why the Western left has failed to organize a substantial revolutionary movement is complex, but I've yet to find a better answer to this question than Carlos's new book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, which is why we feel that this is such an important text. The book addresses in a theoretical and honest way some of the particular stances of the American left that had never made any sense to me in my practical organizing experience, such as the idea that we can't reach out to working class Republican voters or Trump supporters and teach them about Marxism because this would qualify as recruiting fascists. This was an idea that always perplexed me as someone who had lived among working class Midwestern Republican voters my whole life, and who knew that while most of them are politically confused or backwards, as Tom said earlier, the vast majority of them are not fascistic. And many of the older ones only stopped voting Democrat when the party abandoned organized labor during the era of Bill Clinton and over the last 40 years of neoliberalism. Additionally, after studying politics in undergrad, or geopolitics in undergrad rather, in countries like Venezuela and China, I was extremely surprised at the lack of international solidarity among the Western left and for international socialist experiments, and the willingness of American socialists to condemn socialist experiments abroad, as Bernie Sanders did on the debate stage in 2020, when Mayor Pete Buttigieg accused him of trying to bring Castro's Cuba to the United States. Let it also be noted that Mayor Pete supported Medicare for all himself until he started running for office and that insurance industry money started coming in. But rather than defend the successes of the Cuban healthcare system that have been brought about by Cuban socialism in the face of a crippling 70-year-long plus U.S. embargo, as Carlos and I have done in a series of papers and videos, Bernie Sanders decided to cower and promised that his healthcare system would look nothing like the authoritarian Cuban dictatorship which had forced healthcare and reading upon its people. And this, to me, was a perfect example of what Carlos calls purity fetishism in the book, which prevents many self-described socialists in the West from supporting the struggles of our comrades abroad internationally. They allow one disagreement or one critique or one flaw, one failure of these foreign socialist experiments to cause them to disavow the socialist experiments entirely, disavow everything that our comrades have done internationally to construct socialism in the face of vicious and relentless imperialist aggression from the West. So until Carlos's book, I had really no way of explaining what I saw as strategic and ideological failures in the American left in a world that desperately needs a functional and revolutionary left. In this book, though, Carlos explains the historical roots of this purity fetishism. And he also shows that there's been a great deal of CIA infiltration and controlled opposition that has influenced and allowed the purity fetish to develop along the way. It's worth noting that this analysis would have been impossible without the incredible work of our friend Gabriel Rockhill, who's here today, and his analysis of controlled opposition or the compatible left. So Carlos shows us that when we stop expecting our comrades internationally and domestically to attain or maintain some kind of idealized perfection and realize that we're all flawed because we're all human beings, we can actually forge a path of unity, revolutionary struggle, and construction. To abandon the purity fetish doesn't mean to abandon criticism of those within our organizations or socialist organizations abroad. In fact, it means the opposite. Abandoning the purity fetish allows us to recapture the ability to critique something without condemning it completely, to critique our comrades here at home and existing socialist experiments abroad, while still supporting them in their totality without canceling them entirely, so to speak. To forgo the purity fetish is not to forgo our principles, but rather quite the opposite, to recapture our core principles so that we can unify and rally people around them. Abandoning the purity fetish allows us to work with people and organizations who we may disagree with on some issues, but who hold our core values of class struggle and anti-imperialism. A book like The Purity Fetish is so important at a time like this, when the sadistic imperialists who dominate Western society are pushing us ever closer to nuclear war, because there's never been a more important time for unity amongst those who oppose nuclear war and mutually assured destruction. I truly believe that this is an important book, and I'm deeply honored to have had any part in its publishing, and I'm deeply honored to be here today around so many people who I admire and respect. Carlos is one of my very best friends in the world, and I foresee that continuing until we're both in a nursing home someday, drinking Busch Lights or shots of Dr. Scotch while we discuss questions of theory, geopolitics, and the state of the class struggle. So I'm really proud of our institute for putting out such an important text, and even more proud of my friend for publishing such a text. So congratulations, Carlos. Thanks for being one of the few academics whose heart remains with the working masses, along with all of our amazing friends and comrades who have joined us for this book launch today. That's all I got.
Thank you so much, brother. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and political theorist. He teaches at Villanova University and Greater Ford Prison, and he directs the Critical Theory Workshop at the Sorbonne. His recent books include Counter History of the Present, published in 2017, Interventions in Contemporary Thought in 2016, and Radical History in the Politics of Art from 2014. You may remember him from one of our more popular interviews we've had, where we spoke to him about the Frankfurt School and the creation of what we often refer to as the fake left. So here he is, Gabriel.
Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, now I'm back on. Sorry. So thank you so much, comrades. It's great to be here with you and join you for this important event. I would like to say a few kind of congratulatory remarks for Carlos, and then I have basically three kind of comments based on the book that inspired my thinking and conversations I've been having with organizers in my circles. So first and foremost, I think that the book is quite an important achievement at two levels, at least. One is that it manifests the collective ethos of everything that you've been doing at Midwestern Marx. which is quite an incredible undertaking. It's very impressive that a group of people can kind of build on their own such a significant kind of collectively resourced institute that provides political education, brings people into the struggle, breaks down complex ideas, makes them accessible. You occupy a very important position, and I think that it's to the kind of the testament to Carlos, the ways in which he's been working with other people in this collective endeavor, not simply to fight intellectually against the purity fetish, but to build institutional power in order to struggle back against it. And that collectivity and that institution building should never be given short shrift, because it's one of the most important things that we can do. The book itself, though, is highly accessible. It's very well written. It is urgent insofar as it addresses one of the central problems facing the contemporary left, particularly within the Western and imperialist world. It provides a resounding critique of the purity fetish, of controlled counter-hegemony, and other such things, while also advancing a positive project. So it's dialectical through and through, and that's one of its strengths. And it is also a kind of manifesto for the anti-imperialist left. And so I would encourage everyone to read the book. As Radhika pointed out, it is also relatively thin, so you can get through it. It is erudite without being bogged down in kind of academic referentiality. Regarding the points that I wanted to highlight, the very first one is that Carlos provides us, I think, a very astute account of what I would call the dialectics of socialism, meaning that the relationship between capitalism and socialism is not the relationship between two fixed socioeconomic systems, as if there would be capitalism over here, which would be A, and socialism over here, that would be B. On the contrary, socialism is a collective project that is built out of the skeletal system of capitalism in its decline. Therefore, socialism inherits so many of the problems that plague the history of capitalism, and it is tasked with doing somewhat the impossible. That is moving from a system that is based principally on profit over people to one in which people are put at the center of the socioeconomic system. One of the favorite jokes that I've heard about the socialist project is the following. It says that socialism looks good on paper, but in reality, you just get invaded by the United States. This, of course, addresses the fact that we've never had a free socialist country emerge in the history of the world. We have only had what Michael Parenti calls socialism under siege. So every single socialist experiment has been the target of imperialist destruction. This means that socialism, as it emerges in the very real world, has to deal with these very concrete material factors that it does not control because it is coming from the bottom up, meaning that its struggle is from the bottom up. Moreover, socialist countries need to develop by starting out from a point of, for a position within the geopolitical world of structural underdevelopment. And they have to do that without relying on many of the principal mechanisms of development under capitalism, such as colonialism and extreme forms of superexploitation. Moreover, socialists inherit all of the political and moral injustices of the capitalist system. Baked-in racism, misogyny and gender oppression, all of the ideologies of the capitalist world. So what we should actually expect, and I think that Carlos's book does a good job of bringing this to the fore, is that the dialectics of socialism is such that we should never expect a pure and perfect socialist system to kind of spring forth as if from the head of Zeus, but instead for it to be racked by a whole series of contradictions related to the fact that it is born out of a system of human degradation, which is the system of capitalism. What is absolutely remarkable, and again, Carlos's book brings this to the fore, as that in spite of all of these odds, or against all of these odds, if you look at the quantifiable data that we currently have, and in fact, there's an interesting study that was done in 1986 that crunched all of the extant data from the World Bank, which couldn't be accused of being a communist sympathizer, and is arguably the largest body of data globally. This study found in 1986 that the physical quality of life index, which tracks such things as life expectancy, infant mortality, access to healthcare, access to education, and other such things, that the socialist countries had a more favorable performance than all capitalist countries at a similar level of development in 22 of 24 comparisons that were undertaken in the study by Shirley Saraceto and Howard Waitskin. So what's extraordinary is that even though socialism is emerges in this dialectical tension with capitalism, it has nonetheless proven itself successful at the level of its material gains for working class people. In that regard, Carlos's book is an invitation for us to think very differently about the socialist project than the Western kind of fetishization of purity tends to make us think about it. That is, both recognizing the extreme difficulties of the socialist project and also supporting and celebrating the incredible, incredible gains that have been made for humanity, and for that matter, for planet Earth, given the environmental policies of the socialist countries, or at least in many instances. My two other comments have to do with a series of thoughts that were provoked in both reading Carlos's book and then discussing it with some people who are very close to me. The first is how the purity fetish relates to the longstanding criticisms of utopian socialism, and in particular those that were already expressed by Marx and Engels. You can look at the Communist Manifesto, or in The Poverty of Philosophy, where Marx explains, I have the quote here, but I won't read it in the interest of time. Marx explains that utopian socialism was largely a product of the lack of development of both the capitalist system and the state of class struggle at that point in time, meaning that the class struggle had not yet fully revealed to the working class the systemic workings of the capitalist ruling class. And therefore, scientific socialism, as emerged with the work of Marx and Engels, was actually a consequence of material evolution of both capitalism and class struggle. And so one of my questions for Carlos is, how would you understand the purity fetish in relationship to these kind of long-standing critiques of utopian socialism, and in particular, those critiques that foreground the material forces that are operative behind these ideologies? I think this echoes some of the things that Radhika said, because I'd like to hear Carlos more on the central role played by the labor aristocracy in the history of the imperial left, and what kind of material forces are operative behind this, promotion of an idea that socialism has to be something that is structurally impossible. It has to be absolutely pure and come forth in the world in a way that would be untainted by the history of capitalism. It has to be basically immaterial. And ultimately, that's what a lot of them want, is an immaterial socialism, meaning one that would never exist, so that the extant social relations that tend to situate them on the top of the labor structures globally persist and maintain their own material superiority in that regard. My last comment / question, it was also kind of provoked by a similar series of thoughts. And that is that if we take seriously the material role of the labor aristocracy in the imperial core for promoting certain forms of ideology, such as that of the purity fetish, then what are we to make of, this is a comment recently made in a book called Communisme by Bruno Guigues that I strongly recommend. He said that, drawing on Gramsci, that the struggle, the class struggle within the imperial core takes on a different form. And that is that since socialist revolutions have generally proven themselves to be more successful, obviously within the tricontinent, within the global south, and we have not had one within the global north or the imperial core, doesn't that mean that the class struggle in the imperial core takes on a slightly different form? And Guigues draws on the distinction that Gramsci makes between a war of position and a war of maneuver, saying that within the imperial core, there is such a deeply developed level of industrialized ignorance due to the control of the cultural apparatus and the kind of programmed ignorance through the schooling system and through the general kind of cultural institutions, if you will, of the Western world, that the Western left is faced with a very fundamental problem. And that is that the masses, for the most part, are profoundly uneducated about very basic things about how the world works. So Guigues' argument is that therefore what we need in the imperial core is a war of position, a kind of trench warfare in which we focus principally on hegemonic struggle, meaning struggle for political education. And that the war of movement, the war in which you'd actually be able to seize power in a revolutionary manner, like has been done across the global south in certain instances, is, for the most part, I take it, that's at least what he's implicitly suggesting, not really on the table at this point in time. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't advocate for that. And it doesn't mean as well that, I think that someone like George Jackson is quite clear in this regard. If there is not a revolutionary situation, the onus is on us to produce and make that revolutionary situation. So Geeg's position, I take it, is that, well, to do that in the imperial core requires tasks that are slightly different. And that the fight against the purity fetish that Carlos is undertaking in this book is part of, I take it, a kind of larger struggle for political education and for wresting control away from the controlled counter-hegemony while building up a real counter-hegemony, like Midwestern Marx is trying to do, like the International Manifesto Group is trying to do, like the Critical Theory Workshop is trying to do, and like a lot of other organizations that we all work with are trying to do. And so these are my three kind of general thoughts on Carlos's book, and a few questions for the discussion to follow. And I'll finally close just by saying that it's extremely impressive and inspiring to have such a young scholar and vibrant mind doing such important work at an early stage in his career. And I really look forward to continuing to collaborate with everyone at Midwestern Marx, learn more from you, and continue the struggle.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. That was amazing, and it got me very, very excited for the discussion to follow. Touches on all kinds of stuff that we talk about all the time at the Institute. Our next speaker, though, is Dr. Alan Freeman. Alan is a former principal economist with the Greater London Authority and is now a research affiliate at the University of Manitoba. Along with Radhika Desai, he is the co-editor of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. He's also the co-editor of the Future of Woke Capitalism book series from Pluto Press and the Geopolitical Economy book series from Manchester University Press. He's a committee member of the Association for Heterodox Economics and vice chair of the World Association for Political Economy. He's a board member for Video Pool Winnipeg and the Christopher Freeman Trust, and a former board member of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra. Go ahead, Alan.
I have to say that's nearly all true, but I'm not a doctor. Just to get that clear off, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, a mistake everybody makes. I'm very pleased to be in this discussion for two reasons. One is that it's a wonderful book, but the second is that that we have at least three organizations whose origins are completely different, who are sitting around and actually talking. And I must say, in my experience of the pure left, this is a very rare event. When we were, kind of involved in the little small struggle organizations and we met in a pub even, the first thing we do is start shouting at each other or singing songs in the bus to shout each other down. And this is a very important new stage, I think, in the evolution of the left, is actually to acknowledge the variety of different views that exist and discuss them out. So that's a very welcome event, it's a very welcome book. So I often say that I often prefer to discuss with people that I don't agree with to people I agree with, because if I discuss with people I agree with, I know what they're going to say. So the reason for discussing with people you don't agree with is precisely to bring out difference, which is the purpose of dialectic. So I'm going to kind of, in a humorous way, say, I'm going to throw out a criticism of the book, which is a friendly criticism. I think it's too soft on the hard left. And I'll try and do a second thing, which I don't know if I can do in the time, is try and bring that into an evaluation of a very important contribution of the book, which is its critique of the Socratic and Platonic tradition. Now you may think, what the hell is the connection between those? So I'm going to read a few quotes out to you that may make you think more about, what did Plato actually say? The first is Alfred North Whitehead, who said, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So everything you've been brought up on, that you've been told is the basis of Western democracy, owes most of what it's claims to its heroes Plato and Socrates. What they forget is that both Plato and Socrates were irreconcilable enemies of democracy. Their position in Greek society arose after the defeat of the Athenian democracy at the hands in the Peloponnesian War, partly self-inflicted, but nevertheless a defeat, a tyranny of the Council of 30, who killed nearly 5% of the Athenian population, exiled many more. And they came to the conclusion after looking at this that the problem was democracy, and what you needed was a rule of the experts, a rule of the philosophers. And this rule had to be based on what Plato calls the noble lie. So your recipe for democracy is, first of all, you put experts in charge. You don't have anything to do with democracy, which Socrates and Plato both called the rule of the ignorant. And second is you have to lie to them. That's the foundation of Western democracy. And the lie in Plato is justified in the following terms, that it's necessary in order to maintain social harmony. So it's a noble lie. And he tells a fictional tale known as the myth or parable of the metals. And this is the origin of the three social classes who compose his ideal, his pure republic, which never came into existence. It's the first, perhaps the first form of the Purity Fetish. And these are the gold, the silver, and the iron. And the gold, the silver, and the iron are the rulers, the workers, the iron, and the guys in the middle who kind of, do the real business. Now, I want to put it to you that noble lie and the rule of the philosophers are what we are actually getting from the far left. And I'll explain this in the following way. I have never met a member of the far left who is, and I count myself as a member of the far left, but of a far left purist organization that has justified supporting the provisional IRA in Marxist terms, or defending Saddam Hussein in Marxist terms, or defending the Iranian Revolution in Marxist terms, or siding with Russia in the aggression of NATO against it that provoked the current war in Marxist terms. I've never heard any justification for supporting socialist China in Marxist terms from any of these people. So what are these people? They are apologists for imperialism. Let's say that bluntly, let's say that loud, and let's say that clearly. And the way they do it is the same as the method of Plato, which is they construct this basically based on a confusion between form and essence. They construct an ideal form. Our ideal society has to be like this. And if it's not, it's wrong, it's impure, it's imperfect. But the doctrine of essence that was developed in the Hegelian Marxist tradition is something very different. It says, no, we don't look at what's ideal, we look at what lies behind what we see. Now, in both of them, they can appear quite similar because they make a contrast between what you see and what's really going on. So this gets distorted. I mean, I have a lovely quotation from Walras, the founder of modern economics. He says, a truth long ago demonstrated by the Platonic philosophy is that science does not study corporeal entities, but universals, of which these entities are manifestations. Corporeal entities come and go, but universals remain forever. Universals, their relations and their laws are the object of all scientific study. Now that, you could sort of square that with a kind of Hegelian narrative that underneath the reality, there lies underneath the observed superficial appearance, there lies something. But it's actually it's the opposite. And there's another beautiful quotation from Plato that illustrates this, because Plato argued that in order to stop people resorting to the sort of, the sin of looking at things as they really were, what you have to do is you have to have gods who are out of reach. So Plato actually invented the idea that the heavens are the abode of the gods, not Mount Olympus, but the heavens, because they're so far above us that you will never have people saying, I want to go there and see what's happening. Nowadays you did have it, but in Plato's time you didn't. And he justifies this in this wonderful phrase, which I've just sums it all up. No one can ever gain knowledge of any sensible object by gaping upwards, any more than by shutting his mouth and searching for it on the ground, because there can be no knowledge of sensible things. These intricate traceries in the sky are no doubt the loveliest and most perfect of material things, but still part of the visible world, and they therefore fall far short of the true realities, the real relative philosophies in the world of pure number and all perfect geometrical figures. So he says, not only can you not see things in the heavens, but there's no point in looking at the heavens because the real heaven is even beyond all that. It's completely inaccessible. Now, how does that work? The gold and the silver and the iron are with us today. The gold is the world created by the imperialists. It's perfect. It's wonderful. Everything else is an inferior form of that. Then we have the people who kind of go along with that, and they're the silver, the people who collaborate with that. And then you have the iron, who is everybody else. And everybody else is inferior. The fundamental way that Russians are described in the narrative of the West is, in the words of somebody like Josep Borrell, Europe is a garden and everywhere else is a jungle. That's naked racism. And when people in the Ukrainian government persistently say that the problem is all Russians, not the Russian state, not the Russian government, but all Russians, that is a naked racism. And it's only accepted by people from pure Marxism because they use the pure Marxism to prove that Russia is just an imperialist country like any other. Now, I'm going to say one more thing to bring that all back together. And this is the what you might call the classic origin of purity, which is the way in which Lenin defended the Russian Revolution against the charge of putschism. And he does that by reference to the Paris Commune. And from the notion of the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the prototype thereof, there comes the justification that he gives for the Soviet form of the state. I think I have no issue with that at all. But I think that subsequently what happened is people then, through the Purity Fetish in its earliest form, said, only if you have a Soviet republic do you have a pure democracy, do you have a real democracy, do you have something that fits the criteria of Marxism-Leninism. Now, what's wrong with that? Lenin never says that the Paris Commune proves that the ideal form of democracy is Soviet democracy. What he says, and this is essence as opposed to form, is that you cannot have a socialist revolution, you cannot go to a new form of society in which the working class rules without smashing the existing state. There are 100 different ways to smash the state. Sometimes it just dissolves itself and then you can have a quite peaceful process. Sometimes it fights back very, very hard and then you have to have a revolutionary war, as in Cuba or as in China. Sometimes you simply have an upsurge against the state and the state virtually disappears and is replaced by something that you don't quite understand, like the Iranian state. But to impose on that the criterion that it has to meet the ideal form is to misunderstand the need to look at it from the standpoint of essence. That is, does it advance and defend the interests of working people, and does it retard and make more difficult the interests of the property owners? And I'll finish on a wonderful statement that was given in one of our webinars by an Iranian revolutionary, which is the analogy of the ice cream. He says, the way that revolutionaries approach revolutions is they say, I'm going to an ice cream van and I'm going to get offered a strawberry ice cream, a Neapolitan ice cream, a vanilla ice cream, and I'll choose the strawberry one. He says, when you have a revolution, you don't get a choice. You get the damn ice cream and you take what you're given. And I think that notion that you deal with the reality, you look at the essence behind it, but you do not worship form, is the true way that the tradition of Marxism and of all the revolutionary currents that one finds, whether they call themselves Marxists or not, should be adopted and taken on board in a rich and broad dialogue with Bolivarianism, with the Iranian revolutionary tradition, with the emerging currents that we now see in the very fervent debates going on in Russia, with the socialist China and the Chinese Communist Party and the Vietnamese Communist Party. That's the kind of debate we need, a broad debate in which we all engage with each other on the basis of mutual respect without any precondition that we're going to say this is pure and if you don't say that, then we're actually just going to go into another shouting match. So that's me. I hope it was coherent at some level.
Incredibly coherent. Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you to everyone. These have been absolutely wonderful. Before we move over to our sort of open conversation segment, everyone's presentation combined sort of kept reminding me of a famous quote by Engels, which is in reference to those using a world outlook of a purity fetish. And he said, what these gentlemen lack is dialectics. And it always comes back to that. It seems that they're developed this inability to draw a line between form and essence, right, that the particular form a given thing takes on becomes its essential content for this. And I think that's a big problem. That might be a good way to start the conversation off, but there are 1,000 topics. We're not going to get to that just yet, though, because next is our sort of main event. We're going to hear from Carlos Garrido, who is a Cuban-American PhD student and instructor in philosophy at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He has an MA in philosophy from that same institution. His research focuses include Marxism, Hegel, early 19th century American socialism, and socialism with Chinese characteristics. He's an editor and theorist at the Midwestern Marx Institute, and editor for the Journal of American Socialist Studies. His popular writings have appeared in dozens of socialist magazines in various languages. As a political analyst with a focus on Latin American, especially Cuba, he has appeared in dozens of radio and video interviews around the world. He's the author of The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, and also edited and introduced Marxism and the Dialectical Materialist Worldview, an anthology of classical Marxist texts on dialectical materialism. He's also a very good friend of mine, so everybody get ready to hear Carlos.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure to hear all of your comments, and it's an honor to have you all here discussing the work, which has been very much shaped by the conversations I've had with everyone, both from the Institute and friends from the Institute, like Alan, Radhika, Gabriel, and Carlos Martinez, who was going to be here, but unfortunately couldn't make it as well. There's as well. But I have a not so short presentation here, and if I get long, please someone feel free to stop me. But in an 1875 letter to Wilhelm Brack, Marx would say that, quote, every step of real movement is more important than a dozen programs. This is the living spirit of Marxist analysis. The emphasis is laid on real struggles, on the forms of social formation these struggles discover in their overturning, to a lesser or greater extent, of the current state of affairs. This is the essence of one of the most central ways in which Marx and Engels formulate what communism is. As they say in the German ideology, quote, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things, end quote. The purity fetish outlook which permeates Western Marxism is fundamentally antagonistic to this living and open Marxist Weltanschauung worldview. It holds pure static ideas as sacred, and it consistently rejects reality when such reality desecrates its pure ideals. This is the essence of the purity fetish outlook. It is an incessant passing of judgment grounded on a superficial assessment of whether reality measures up to pure ideas or not. Ideologically, it is deeply rooted in the traditions of Western philosophy, dating back at least to the Eleatic school 500 years before Christ. In this school, thinkers like Parmenides and Zeno would put forth the view that truth is unchanging, one, and indivisible. To accept change, contradiction, and a heterogeneous understanding of totality would be to participate in the way of falsity and opinion. With the exceptions of Heraclitus, Hegel, and Marxism, this form of thinking has dominated Western thought up to our day. And in the Western Marxists, it takes various distinctive forms which, while sustaining the appearance of Marxist analysis, is devoid completely of its revolutionary substance. The diagnosis Engels gave reductive Marxists in an 1890 letter to Conrad Schmidt applies fittingly to Western Marxists. What all these gentlemen lack is dialectics. When I first developed the concept of the purity fetish in October 2021, there was primarily one form through which I observed the purity fetish manifesting itself in Western Marxism. If there is a common thread found in the Western Marxist tradition, it is its unwavering rejection of socialist experiments, especially those led by communist parties. In the 1990s, following the overthrow of the Soviet Union, Michael Parenti had labeled them the adherents of pure socialism because they imagined, as he argued, quote, what socialism would be like in a world far better than this one, where no strong state structure or security force is required, where none of the value produced by workers needs to be expropriated to rebuild society and defend it from invasion and internal sabotage. Gabriel Rockhill, who is, of course, here with us, called their brand of critical theory ABS theory, as in anything but socialism. Their work in direct and indirect forms ultimately leads to an acceptance of the capitalist order, since socialism is judged to be far worse. The Western Marxists ignore the constant hybrid warfare under which the successful revolutionary projects have to construct socialism. They ignore the effects, especially for the experiments in the global South and East, that centuries of colonialism have had in keeping these areas poor and subjugated politically, economically, and culturally to the West. They ignore the colossal pressures, both historically inherited and contemporary, under which socialism has struggled for. And most importantly, they ignore how these pressures shape the parameters of embryonic socialist construction in these areas. As I argue in the book, socialism is not betrayed when encountering the external and internal pressures of imperialism and a national bourgeois class. It is forced to take more so-called authoritarian positions to protect the revolution. Socialism is not betrayed or transformed into state capitalism in the derogatory non-Leninist sense. When faced with a backwards economy, it takes the risk of tarrying with its opposite and engages a process of opening up to foreign capital to develop its productive forces. The authoritarian moment, or the moment of opening up to foreign capital, are not an annihilating negation of socialism, as the Western Marxists would have you believe, but the sublation of the idealistic conception of a pure socialism, especially in its earliest stages. A socialist Russia that had not taken the strategic retreat towards Lenin's new economic policy amidst the onslaught of the difficulties of war communism, which were forced upon them, of course, by the invasion of 15 countries after the revolution, including the UK, the US, Japan, Italy, and others, would not have survived. Likewise, without the so-called Stalinist collectivization, not only would the Soviet Union have remained unindustrialized and poor, but the Hitlerite forces would have been able to, as the West expected and hoped, trample over the Judeo-Bolshevik menace, destroying the first worker state and the notion that working class people could indeed rule themselves. Similarly, a less authoritarian treatment of the Batista goons after the Cuban Revolution would have opened the window for imperialism and national counter-revolutionary forces to overthrow the popular revolution. A less authoritarian Democratic People's Republic of Korea would not have survived the hybrid warfare waged on it by the U.S. empire and its NATO lackeys, who killed 20% of their population during the war and who have strangled their country with one of the most aggressive sanctions regimes in the world for the last 70 years. The authoritarianism that the Western Marxist purity fetish condemns is in every instance a necessary component to protect a revolution's sovereignty and socialist democracy. But since they treat authoritarianism or democracy abstractly and fail to ask democracy for what class and authoritarianism against which class, they are unable to see the necessary role authoritarianism against imperialism and against the national classes which collaborate with imperialism plays in securing a richer, broader, and more developed form of socialist democracy for the common people. The Western Marxist purity fetish makes them immune to seeing socialist construction as a process, one which will undoubtedly develop contradictions which will in time likely be overcome. A paradox arises in the Western Marxist sacrosanct abstract ideals. Namely, while socialism is always too impure to obtain their support, these same Marxists won't hesitate to endorse, directly or indirectly, capitalist imperialism in its attempts to undermine both socialist experiments and non-socialist experiments that exist outside of the US's sphere of influence. As Alan Freeman and Radhika Desai write in their recent dossier calling for a global anti-imperialist left, quote, it no longer makes sense to describe the current Western left as left, since they are, at their core, partisans of Western imperialist states. This so-called Marxism, this form of so-called Marxism, grounded on the purity fetish outlook, has been for decades an indispensable component of bourgeois hegemony. Their theorists' role as left-wing delegitimizers of socialist and anti-imperialist states have earned them the part of being the tambourines enhancing the tune of mainstream media's war drums. They are the agents of a controlled counter-hegemony, the radical recuperators, as Rockhill calls them, that absorb any and all dissenting attitudes in the masses into their compatible left, leaving capitalist imperialism fundamentally unchallenged. At its core, the purity fetish Marxists express a form of what Georg Lukács called indirect apologetics. Their superficial repudiation of capitalism, when conjoined with their rejection of real socialism, is one of the most effective ways of affirming the dominant capitalist mode of life. They accept, at least in practice, Churchill's dictum about capitalism being the worst system except for all the other ones. For them, bourgeois liberal democracy is, like the world that Leibniz's God has created, the best of all possible worlds. This makes it the ideal form of controlled opposition, an opposition that buys fully into Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative, and hence will never substantially oppose the existing order, for it considers the alternatives far worse. As Ketty Shukroff describes it, their key function is in the radicalization of the impossibility of exit. As the general crisis of capital are intensified by what John Bellamy Foster has called the two forms of exterminism, nuclear war, and the planetary ecological emergency, it becomes indispensable for Marxists to struggle against this purity fetish outlook. It is a worldview which not only obstructs the acquisition of truth, but vacillates from simply being revolutionary futile to being an indispensable material and ideological force for the conservation of the dominant order. In the US, the purity fetish takes an additional two forms, which I would like to briefly bring up. In each case, again, it prevents the acquisition of truth and the development of a revolutionary movement. There is a strong current on the left, both in social democrat and in communist spaces, that view the Trump voting part of the working class as constituting a fascist threat. These workers are seen as a contaminated basket of deplorables, in the words of Comrade Clinton, who are unfit to be organized. As someone who has spent their whole organizing life in the Midwest, the area of the country most densely populated with pro-Trump workers, these sentiments are far from true. But even if they were, even if this was the most backward part of the working class, what is the point of communists if not precisely to lift the consciousness of workers, regardless of their ideological starting point? Would we not just be preaching to the choir if we expect the working class to already meet all the pure standards of our enlightened social consciousness? The task of communists is to organize along class lines, not ideological lines, and to raise the consciousness of workers, regardless of their ideological standing, to socialist class consciousness. As Gramsci would put it, the task of communists is to find the kernels in the masses' incoherent worldview which could be re-articulated towards socialism. Patronizing attitude towards the masses makes this task impossible. One must learn from the masses in order to guide them towards socialism. The educators, as Marx noted, must themselves be educated. If the purity fetish leads one to rejecting, if the purity fetish leads some to reject organizing the 40 or so % of workers which voted for Trump, this paralyzes the class struggle at a time when conditions couldn't be riper for its development. If this is true of those on the ultra left who cancel the Trump part of the working class because it fails to meet their pure standards of what enlightened social consciousness workers must have before being organized, it couldn't be more true of those fringe elements which see all non-indigenous workers as settlers. The second unique form the purity fetish takes in the American Marxists can be found in their assessment of their national past. The dialectical worldview, both in Hegel and in Marxism, rejects the idea of an unchanging, pure, ahistorical universal, and instead urges that universals are necessarily tied to historically conditioned concrete particulars. Universals are always concrete, that is, they take their form through the particular. What does this tell us about socialism? Well, simply that there's no such thing as abstract socialism. Socialism is a universal which cannot exist unless concretized through the particular. In every country it has taken root in, socialism has had to adapt itself to the unique characteristics of the peoples that have waged and won the struggle for political power. In China, this has taken the form of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In Cuba, this has meant incorporating José Martí and the anti-colonial traditions into socialist construction. In Venezuela, this has taken the form of Bolivarian socialism. In the plurinational state of Bolivia, this has taken the form of combining Marxism with the indigenous communist traditions which have been around for centuries. In the continent of Africa, this has taken the form of Pan-African socialism, and so on. In each case, the struggle has been, as Georgy Dimitrov had already noted in 1935, national in form and socialist in content. In various parts of the US left, the purity fetish outlook has obscured this historical lesson and made rampant the phenomenon which Dimitrov called national nihilism. Our people's history is reduced to slavery, settler colonialism, imperialism, and all the evils of capital and its state. In doing so, They reject drawing from their national past to give form to socialist content. Far from the progressivism they see in this, what this actually depicts is a liberal tinted American exceptionalism, which thinks that the struggle for socialism in the US will itself not have to follow this concrete universal tendency seen around the world, where socialism functions as the content which takes form, that is, concretizes, according to the unique circumstances in which it is being developed. This has prevented the US left from genuinely learning from its progressive history and connecting with its people. It makes impossible the task of rearticulating the kernels of progressive thought in our people's common sense towards socialism. It prevents the American Marxists from understanding their national past dialectically as a social totality in constant movement propelled by its imminent objective contradictions. Because our national past is impure, the purity fetish Marxists make the task of learning from our progressive struggles, from Du Bois to Douglas and Winston, impossible. These figures and the movements they were attached to are held to be, in a form of left-wing McCarthyism, anti-American. The anti-communist myth we fought against last century has been accepted in this one, namely that America and the American people are on one side and socialism on the other, with an unbridgeable gap in the middle. The acceptance of this McCarthyite nonsense has been thanks to the development of the purity fetish within a greatly debilitated communist movement that was left wandering in the dark after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. But times have changed, and so can we. Today, as younger generations of Americans face, for the first time in history, living standards worse than their parents, as 60,000 people continue to die a year because they do not have health insurance, as 60% of Americans are a lost paycheck away from joining the 600,000 homeless wandering around in a country with 33 times as many homes as many empty homes as homeless people, as 34 million Americans, including 1 in 8 children, experience hunger in a country which throws away 40% of its food supply, as stagnant wages and inflation have working class Americans struggling to make ends meet, as failed proxy wars and global de-dollarization kicks in, demonstrating with undoubtable clarity the moribund character of U.S. capitalist imperialism, as, in short, it becomes clear that neither the people nor the ruling class can continue in the old way, signifying the objective revolutionary conditions of our historical moment. The purity fetish today stands as the primary barrier preventing the development of the subjective conditions for a revolutionary movement. We must overcome the purity fetish outlook before it obliterates our ability to overthrow, in a timely manner, our demented ruling class that is pushing the world to the precipice of nuclear Armageddon in the name of sustaining their global hegemony. These enemies of humanity are wobbling, but, as Lenin said, they will never fall without being toppled over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, brother. That was amazing. We're going to go over to sort of an open discussion now. I'd like to kick it off by sort of tailing on what Carlos was just saying, because what he was saying is so incredibly important. In his remarks, he mentioned that the purity fetish left makes it impossible to organize a revolutionary movement. And so this leads me to think, should our goal be to start a new movement, one that embraces the working masses, not in some abstract ideal or in bits and pieces based on who has acceptable ideas, but wherever they may be, and in meeting them where they may be, in this way, be able to bring them forward and create something new as our new era sort of develops. Anyone who wants to, just jump in whenever you'd like. You can unmute yourselves, or we can do it. It's up to you.
I'll jump in and just say I don't think one builds movements. I think movements build themselves. And one of the characteristics of the far left purity movements that I've been associated with is the entire emphasis on what we have to do to build the movement. And that actually is a form of the Platonic notion of the rule of the philosophers, that we know what's true and we're going to tell you masses what. What we have to do is look at the historical reality of what the masses are doing and analyze what the essence of that is. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this from British experience. I mean, the whole far left was is particularly, no, I won't do names and pack drill, but let's just say the largest organization in GB was going to build a new party, and they took on a certain mass character at a certain point in time. Then along came a character you may have heard of in the 1980s called Tony Benn. Tony Benn was a very radical left Labour who had moved from quite right-wing positions, not fascist positions, but, conventional establishment positions, to endorsing workers' control, workers' democracy, denouncing the colonial tradition of Britain, and came within a hair's breadth of becoming the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Now, what was the content of Benninism? It was an old tradition in British politics, going back to John Wilkes, of asserting democracy. And this was particularly important in the historic conditions of Britain, because I don't know if you are aware of this, the British state is the least democratic imperialist state in the world. And that's saying something for people from the USA, but it is fundamentally a colonial relic. It's run by, the mere fact that you can celebrate the election of a Charles III, given that you executed Charles I, just tells you what it's all about, right? In fact, in Cuba, I remember meeting a guy in the street when I was there in 1972, and this guy just said to me, "Look, at least we got rid of our monarch." You still have that was a proletarian understanding that has lived with me ever since. Then along comes Corbyn. Now, there are many problems with Corbyn, and I think there were mistakes that were made by the Corbyn team, not necessarily by Corbyn. But nevertheless, you have to understand the content of the Corbynist movement to understand what's going on. Now, on the other hand, you can have mass movements that are profoundly reactionary in character. And this may be a source of dispute, which is that I think, for example, the truckers' convoy that we encountered in Canada, I don't know about the experience in the US, I don't want to lecture, but it had a profoundly reactionary character, and that was unalterable. That one has to get into discourse with people who are taken in by it, but with the movement itself, the autonomy it raised fascists. Brutal movement that originated with the convoy that started in the Midwest and specifically diverted itself to join to smash a picket line on the only unionized oil refinery in Alberta. Right, as it's national working class movement. So one has to distinguish between movements and organizations, and one has to look at what is the potential and the origin of each movement as it emerges. That's not a purity line. That's just saying one has to be concrete. With Hitler, there was nothing you could do except smash it. That's what Nazism was, and that's what Nazism is today. There's nothing you can do but fight it. In the course of fighting it, people will come over. People will see that you're right. The battle between socialism and communism and Nazism is an ideological as well as, and we never close our doors to anybody. Never, 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 never. If people want to cross and say we were wrong, fine. We need you in our army. But in my opinion, that's what the left should really be doing, is looking concretely at movements as they emerge. And we should debate in a pluralistic way amongst ourselves, well, what is the real nature of this movement? And we can have that debate without rancor, without purism, particularly if we rid ourselves of the purity fetish. We're not judging the movement, we're analyzing it. So I'll just sort of throw that in, The provisional IRA is another excellent case in point. Everybody said, the communist official IRA, those are the good guys. But the provisional IRA got one thing right, which is you have to stand up for Irish national independence. And they gradually dropped all the reactionary elements of the old tradition of Sinn Féinism. No, not Sinn Féinism, of the Irish liberation struggle. I wouldn't blame Sinn Féin for it, but there were reactionary elements in that mass movement, and they gradually got rid of them, and they educated themselves, and they educated the members, and they educated the public, and Ireland passed, clear abortion laws, better than America right now. Okay, as a result of the struggle of the provisional IRA. So you don't judge things by their cover; you judge things by what's in the tin.
I think the provisional IRA is a really good study of this, because, like you say, it did have a lot of reactionary elements in it, but it was able to overcome these in a lot of ways. And it reminds me a lot of a sort of new labeling that's come up among the purity fetish left, that anything that isn't a sort of historical and national nihilistic position is labeled a pat sock. It's their new term, meaning patriotic socialist, as if these socialism can't be inherently patriotic as it is in China, right? And so it's their way of dismissing anything in this new form that embraces the revolutionary tradition of the USA. Because they see things through this purity fetish outlook, they have this one-sided view of the US that can only see, for example, Jim Crow, rather than the entire thing, which is Jim Crow as well as the Black freedom struggle, right? As a contradiction that is being overcome. And I think getting over that sort of stuff, especially with the power that the branding has over people's minds, is really important.
Yeah, I wanted to get back at a comment that Alan made that's connected to the critique which you made, and I think it's a good, fair critique that I was, in terms of citation at least, a bit soft on the hard left. I think in terms of the ideas, I was tackling the ideas, but sometimes not pointing out directly who it was that I was talking to. In part, those are difficulties that arise thanks to the nature of the organizations that we are in, and party politics stuff that limits that direct engagement and calling out of who it is that we're talking about. But I do see that what's in the Marxist-Leninist tradition, what it's been labeled as left, as ultra leftism, and as right opportunism, I see them in the U.S. Consistently overlapping in their assessment of politics, of geopolitics, of national politics, and I see that overlap as grounded in the purity fetish outlook. So I do think that the part of the problem that's tied to not supporting China, it's done. I think with the case of China, something that's done. You can visibly see how the social democrats and the ultra left align in their rejection of China for various reasons. The ultra left, because China's not a purely nationalized economy, centrally planned and command economy, no markets, and the SOC Dems, because they accept the BS narratives, the atrocity propaganda about Uyghur genocide and all this sort of hilariously false and baseless things. I think both of those tendencies feed off of each other and in various ways mirror each other as a sort of whole that represents what controlled counter-hegemonic politics has really been like in the U.S. As far as the movements, I think part of the difficulty is that we have had a good amount of movements, at least in the last 2 decades in the U.S. We had the movement against the war in Iraq. We had the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Bernie movement to a certain extent. It was both tied to the campaign and somewhat separate to it. You still have groups that are pushing for Medicare for all and getting a lot of people to the streets. The George Floyd protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, it got, I believe the estimates are anywhere from 25 to 35 million people on the streets, which is the largest movement that we've had in the U.S. Now you have movements erupting after, basically the lynching of Jordan Neely. And, we have shown a propensity to, the masses have shown a propensity to be willing to throw themselves out into the street and to protest. And I think that part of the problem here is that this movement, which shows it's I think a component in seeing how the objective revolutionary conditions are here. This movement is somewhat blind. It needs ideological clarity. It needs a systematic analysis of why it is that these particular things that they see, what is it rooted in, and how can you challenge it? And it needs a vanguard organization. And a vanguard organization, of course, doesn't just become one when it says it is one. It needs to develop organically out of that. And I think part of what, the project of developing the purity fetish is trying to see, maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly, what are the conditions which are preventing the development of that type of organization that can grab at a time where the objective conditions for revolution are so ripe, that can grab a people which have shown themselves to be capable of protesting against the established order and that lack ideological guidance. And, perhaps it connected to one of the questions that Gabriel brought up concerning the war of positions. I think that is one of the central area. That's the war that we have to wage. We can't have anything near to a war of maneuvers in the current ideological state that we're in, and that's going to require understanding the American people, learning from them, and that's not just like a task that you can do in one place and boom, you're set to go. There's so many regional differences. I've had to travel from the South to the Midwest, and you feel the regional differences, the different sorts of associations that people have to various parts of the American tradition. And it's going to take a very concrete and immediate understanding of people's communities, of their people, and how from the common sense, not just understanding, but feelings, desires, aesthetic sensibilities of those people, how can you get kernels and then re-articulate those towards socialism? I think that's the essence of the war of positions. When you go to teach someone about something, you have to begin by where they are already at, and from where they're at, you take them to where you want them to go. And you can't do that if you a priori reject where they're at before engaging with them and seeing what potential they have to go to where we need them to go, which is socialism.
Yeah, if I may just come in there, what I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that were triggered by the last round of comments. When you say you have to begin where people are at, I mean, you're so absolutely right. And one of the dead giveaways of the kind of top-down left that sort of has, where the intellectual and where the brains and numbers, as the Fabians used to put it, are separated, is all the talk about consciousness raising. That somehow, only if everybody in the United States reads Capital, only then you'll get revolution, reads and understands. This is not how it's going to happen. If that's what you're waiting for, that's not. So the real movement towards socialism will inevitably be, as you rightly point out, relatively, it will not emerge in any kind of pure form. The second thing I wanted to say is, this is, when Noah was talking about, how anything that doesn't resemble, does not conform to the purity fetish view is then called patsock or something else disparagingly. That reminded me that, of course there is the purity fetish, and I completely agree with you. But there is also, the purity fetish, let's say, has a certain core, a certain kernel, but around it also is padded a heck of a lot of other things about which there is a sort of purity fetish. And one of them is the ideology of globalization. And that this is also connected with something I've been sort of arguing for some time, which is that, if you look at some of the worst tendencies of the left that you've been criticizing as the purity fetish, you'll see that they take on an accentuated form in the neoliberal period. And in many ways, the purity fetish and associated malaises of the left are actually part of the neoliberalization of the left. Which is why, for example, you get on the left an absolute rejection of any notion of planning. Oh, it's too centralist. You get an absolute rejection of any notion of party. No, only social movements will do so. It's the combination of what I've elsewhere called the combination of Proudhoist economics and network politics. So small is beautiful economics and network politics, rather than planning and party, which is what will be absolutely central. I mean, this is, you have got to take Marx seriously on this. So here comes the point about Patsok. Part of what the thing to which purity, about which whose purity is, people worry so much, is often called internationalism, but it's actually globalization. That is to say, because internationalism still understands the world to be divided into different nations. But it's a certain globalist attitude about revolution, that somehow revolution is going to happen in one loud thunderclap all over the world. And the actual reality of revolutions taking place in different societies, proceeding at different paces towards some kind of ever more developed socialism, is completely rejected. So, China or Russia is rejected. Socialism in one country, we can't have that. But all socialism is going to have to begin in some or the other single country, and then proceed forward from that. And so what I'm also therefore trying to say is that there is a certain cosmopolitan attitude which fails to understand the centrality of nation states in the world that capitalism has created. Just as capitalism has created capitalist classes and working classes, so it has created imperialist nations and imperialized nations. And inevitably, as a consequence, it has created the struggle of nations, to liberate themselves and so on. Some, of course, with greater effectiveness and greater effort than others. But nevertheless, this struggle is there in a latent form everywhere, which is partly why I think we're now looking at a period in which even in countries which are not remotely socialist, you see greater and greater unwillingness as well as inability of even some of the most right-wing governments to go along with what the imperialist West demands of them. Now, I'm not endorsing these governments. I'm the foremost critic, for example, of what is essentially a fascist government in India. But nevertheless, I think it's important to remember that Modi can't, much as he would love to, can't side with the United States. And I think that those are the sorts of things, objective realities we have to recognize. And that's why it is very important also to put at the center of our understanding of what socialism will consist of some conception of the developmental state. Because the fact of the matter is, as we've already pointed out, various people have pointed out, socialism has not occurred. I think, Gabriel, you pointed out most clearly, socialism has not occurred in first world countries. It has always occurred in third world countries. What does that mean? It means that in these countries, they have not just had the luxury of looking after redistribution in an already rich country. They have had to build up the productive forces from a point of great setback created by colonialism and imperialism. So they have, and they have had to do it. So three things. It's great setback, so they have to overcome that setback. Number two, they have to do it without the privilege of imperialism, which is at the foundation of the development of the first world countries. And thirdly, they have to do it against the unremitting resistance of the imperialist countries. So in all of these ways, the centrality of nations, and therefore a progressive understanding of nationalism not as chauvinism, nationalism as a commitment to developing your society and doing so in mutually beneficial relations and solidaristic relations with the struggles of other people. Such a nationalism has existed and it continues to exist in many parts of the world, and that's what you have to look for. One final point. In the post-Second World War period, it pleased the first world countries particularly to always to denigrate, to criticize the very notion of nationalism as though it was a bad thing, which is partly why the word patriotism is now favored. Somehow being a patriot is not bad, at least in Western discourse, and nationalist is bad because inevitably it is chauvinist. And this was precisely because what the West wanted to do was to recreate the imperial world in which nationalism has no role, in which subject countries simply accept their lot. And in third world countries, nationalism was very important. It was the, it was what drove these people to liberate themselves to some extent or another. And I think that so this disdain for nationalism has to be overcome, as I say, not in some kind of a simple-minded endorsement of all forms of nationalism, but by distinguishing between what I once called developmental nationalism and chauvinistic right-wing forms of what I then call cultural nationalism. Not the best labels, but I think they distinguish between a nationalism that wishes to build a society on, build a society, productive society, egalitarian society, and a nationalism which, in the name of some glorious past, is creating new hierarchies and inequalities in society.
I'm just going to be real quick. I think what you're saying, Radhika, is brilliant, and it dovetails really nicely into your own work on the materiality of nations. And I think this is a lot of what the purity fetishists can't really see, is the materiality of the American people having become more and more the American people as time has gone on. Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't French. He wasn't Argentinian. He was American. And just as the, decaying moribund side of America was there, so was he. And this makes us more and more ourselves. What they sort of fall into is what the Soviets used to call rootless or hollow cosmopolitanism, right? And this belief that it's all just in the abstract and you are what you think you are, which is, while they believe they're being internationalist, like you said, what they're really doing is embodying the globalized form of capitalism. And that's an issue. And it's an issue that Lenin and Stalin both addressed a very, very long time ago. That's all.
I might jump
Go on.
in quickly with some additional thoughts, because I agree very much with Radhika and some of the other points that have been raised, that there's an anti-party, anti-state ideology that has really saturated a lot of the Western left. And it's ultimately in opposition to organization in any kind of structural form whatsoever. A lot of this, of course, has affected the US context quite extensively due to the widespread, rampant individualism and libertarian ideology that makes it even worse than the former imperial powers or the junior partners in Europe, so to speak. And so overcoming that opposition to organizational structures in general is extremely important. But part of the problem in doing that is the history of various parties and organizations within the imperial core that have had a very long and deep history of social chauvinism, of supporting colonialism, supporting imperialism, etc. And so one of the things that I think that we need to grapple with, both intellectually and practically, is the fact that within the imperial core, we are in a moment of communist reconstruction. The parties of the past have, we'd have to go through all the details in this, but there have been many mistakes that have been made. There has been, problems with right opportunism. There have been a whole series of issues with these parties. Some of them are attempting to internally reform. Other opportunities have also emerged with relatively recent parties that are breaking with the more kind of reformist and at times opportunistic orientation of some of the earlier socialist parties. This process of socialist reconstruction is incredibly important, because I couldn't agree more with Carlos that what we have in the US context is the enormous force of an extremely oppressed, very exploited working class, while at the same time we have an industrialized attack on any rudder that would ever be given to that working class. Meaning the ship is there, the ship is built, and what the US national security state and other powers constantly do is try to make sure that the ship is just lost at sea and a movement comes and a movement goes, but at the end of the day, we can't actually make real gains for working class people. And so building that rudder in a way that obviously is in continuity with a lot of the deep history of vanguardism, but also learns from that history in ways that mistakes are identified, problems are addressed, etc. And the final thing that I'll say on this front is that in the imperial core, one of the kind of lodestars is that the right word? One of the guiding kind of beacons of our politics should always be anti-imperialism, right? If you're not already in a socialist party or socialist organization, if you're listening to this with a bit of trepidation regarding some of what the speakers are saying, at an absolute minimum, be an anti-imperialist. Support the struggle of the most oppressed and most exploited peoples of the world who are in the tricontinent, who have been under the jackboot of fascist-style imperialism for decades and centuries. It's a human internationalist project and an environmental project that we're involved in, and we have to organize collectively. We have to organize internationally.
I just want to jump in if I can. And Noah, you tell me if can I have another couple of minutes? Because there's a key.
Absolutely not. No, never.
All right.
No, go ahead.
I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to disobey. So Carlos let slip a phrase that I am profoundly disturbed by. As you may gather, I enjoy controversy. So he used the word vanguard organization. I don't like that term. And I'll tell you why. Just like mass movements, vanguards organize themselves. The task is not to set up, and this is part of the purity tradition of the far left, is you set up an organization, say, here we are, guys, we're perfect, or maybe we're imperfect, but we're here, come and join us. I just don't think in any way, at any time in history, that's the way I can't think of any revolutionary movement that's ever been formed in that way. Not even in Cuba. I mean, in Cuba, all the guys said is we're going to fight until we've got rid of Batista. They didn't, you can come and join our army or not, but the general strike was a crucial element of the uprising of the masses that was inspired entirely separately from the Castroist movement, and then they came together afterwards. Now, we were told recently, and you guys can tell me if this is not true or true, but I'm told that a movement of young union organizers, including organizers of the Amazon workers, recently visited Cuba. Now, I would say that that is a vanguard forming itself. That's a vanguard forming itself. Nobody told them to do it. And the task of the left is to go and learn from those people, not to go and preach to them. And, if there's any message that I would have, it's not come and join our organization, but why don't you guys organize yourselves? Why don't you guys, you are in a position to create a new pole. It may fail, it may succeed, but you're in a position. So try, wherever people are at the forefront of struggle, organize. That was the old message of the union movement. Don't mourn, organize. And that, to me, is the way you're going to get a mass movement. And I also think there's a very fundamental thing that we learned in my organization in Britain early on, which is that consciousness doesn't change because people are told things. Consciousness changes because people go through experiences. And the biggest experiences are experiences that touch millions of people. I think that the George Floyd movement, and I think this is something I keep saying to people who don't understand it, for example, in Russia, they just think it's a manifestation of wokeism, was a crucial moment in the historical consciousness, the formation of the historical consciousness of the American working class, because it was the first time I've seen, since 1968, and even then it was on a much smaller scale, white kids go out on the streets and say, we have more in common with black workers than we have with our bosses. And up until then, it was always like, we're superior. That's why Kansas votes the wrong way. It's because people feel I may be trash, I may be useless, but I'm superior to these guys because they're the kids of slaves. And this is the first time people say, Jesus Christ, we're just the same. Now, I think there's a thing called historical memory in the working class. Things like that live on, and you have to, people go off and do weird things, but also there's a historical consciousness there. So I think, this whole issue of how a vanguard forms and how vanguard organizations come into being is something that we need to study. And I would just say one further thing, that the reason that Radhika and I wrote the document which we submitted to the Valdai Club about the need for an anti-imperialist list were two reasons. One was we wanted to define what the left really was and say that there's a profound misunderstanding of what the left is, that thinks that social democratic left is left. It's not left. It's imperialist reactionary crap. It's not. The Democratic Party is no way part of the left. Bernie Sanders is no way part of the left. Right? Ocasio is no way part of the left, because if you say I'm left-wing for my own people, but I'll crap on everybody else, that's not pro-working class, right? It's anti-working class. Okay. But The crucial thing we wanted to say, as well as you don't understand what the left is that you don't understand what you call wokeism is. You know, that I think the bad things that have been thrown at wokeism are just awful because they don't understand what George Floyd was about, and they don't understand the point that Malcolm X got, which is that this is where wokeism began. The racism that is directed against all minorities, particularly what in England we would call black people, people of Afro-Caribbean origin, is profoundly rooted in imperialism. And your sisters and brothers are those who lived in the countries oppressed by imperialism. That's the highest stage of consciousness that has been reached in the American class, is the consciousness of the non-white peoples of America. And I think that, with all due respect to having respect for the patriots, I would say the first thing you have to have respect for is the people who led the real struggles of working people in the United States. And there's a tradition that goes back. People, black people took part in the Tea Parties and so on, but they were a tiny minority. And the whole history of the communist movement is one in which the people who are the most oppressed, and who are particularly doubly and trebly oppressed, women, gay people who just suffered every kind of oppression that there could possibly be. So the only way I can liberate myself is in alliance with everybody else who's oppressed. So the meaning of vanguard to me is not somebody who's in an organization. It's somebody who's reached a profound realization of the condition they find themselves in that leads them to act in a different way.
I think those are wonderful comments, and I don't think that the two things are mutually exclusive. And you mentioned Chris Smalls and the Amazon organizers. We had a stream which landed on May Day, where we broke down how it was that Chris Smalls, in declaring himself a revolutionary and learning from Cuba and being shaped by this milieu of communists, how he's breaking with the traditions of somewhat labor aristocratic trade unionism, which have dominated in the U.S. But part of the reason why that effort succeeded, part of what I would call the yeast that allowed some of it to erupt in Amazon in the Staten Island warehouse, was because there was communist salters there from the Communist Party and some from PSL. Justine Medina, she's one that's been interviewed a few times about it. These are communist organizations that go in through salting and help these working people just push further something that they already want, right? So I'm fully on board with the idea that this whole thing, you make a new party, we're the vanguard. It's very PMC, and it's grounded, as Radhika mentioned, it's very loosey-goosey cosmopolitanism. And we definitely have to be against that. But I do think that that vanguard role arises somewhat organically, but you need organizational structures. You need organizational structures that...
I don't disagree with that at all. You need organizational. The question is how they're created.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the question that we have now. Like, many people in the U.S. are asking themselves, like, do we attach ourselves to these old school parties that have been around for 100 years, that have a certain level of international recognition and resources, and a big chunk of our institute has? Do we attach ourselves to newer parties that have a lot better positions on questions of not going down the right opportunist line when it comes to tailing Democrats and that sort of stuff? And a good other portion of our institute has been involved in those parties. Or is it something new created? I mean, I don't think that we have a response right now. I think that it's important, however, for all of these groups to continue collaborating in an open way that allows for open dialogue, and that in time, if whatever group ends up actually taking up the role of leading the working masses, you join it and you work with them and you collaborate. I think that the sectarianism of the left, all of that has to be tossed aside. That's all the purity fetish. There's more in common that we have with each other than we have in terms of difference, especially when it comes to the key issues of prioritizing the class struggle and the struggle against imperialism.
I want to say, I feel like we've been really lucky from the position of our institute, though. We've actually had some members in our audience who were part of the first efforts to unionize Amazon and Starbucks, and a lot of talk recently about UPS. We have a lot of UPS workers in the audience, including this comment from someone today. So it's almost like we're watching that vanguard form, in its early stages. as we're watching these forms of class struggle in these different workplaces rise up naturally with people who we know are in our audience. We know they're getting theoretically educated. So now you get to the question, I guess, of do you push these people towards, the older parties that Carlos was talking about? What's the importance of getting them organized into a party? Is it important at all? Or is it just to, is the fact that they're organizing their workplace good enough? I don't know. Those are some questions that I had arise too, listening to you guys talk.
I think those tactical questions are really important. I just want to mention really quickly, the Amazon Labor Union was organized on the basis of William Z. Foster's playbook on how to organize industrial unions. Everybody was reading that book and following it like sort of a guideline. And William Z. Foster, for anyone in the audience who might not know, was the chairman of the Communist Party USA at some of its most important moments. He's the man who saved it from liquidation the first time. So back over to the question of tactics and, do we do this form or that form? I'm not sure. I just sort of do what I can where I can to help. And I think that it may end up just being very spread out the way a lot of America is. And maybe the way the PSUV in Venezuela formed. Just a network of different organizations that all came together because they all needed this done. And as time goes on in this country, things are needing done more and more.
On that point, I might just bring up two, I think, kind of touchstones, at least for me, in relationship to these questions. One is that the way in which Lenin both theorized and practically implemented the organization of the Bolshevik Party was by insisting on the fact that you needed a dialectical relationship between the working class and, he says very explicitly, the bourgeois intelligentsia, meaning that the intellectuals are those who have the time, resources, training, etc., in order to do a concrete abstraction from the immediacy of exploitation and understand the system of capitalism as a global system of oppression and exploitation. If you only remain at the level of workers' consciousness, you can have what Hegel would refer to as sense perception. You can have a very refined experience of exploitation and know things that the intellectuals don't know, because you know what it's like to be worked to the bone and feel like you're gonna fucking die, or maybe just die for that matter. But that unity is so absolutely central to party organizing because you need, the sense perception brought together with the understanding, if you will. And obviously you have to do that, to echo one of the points that Alan made, in a way that's not patronizing and talking down to workers, etc., and recognizing that there are intellectuals who come from an organic experience of the working class, I think, like many of us. And so in that regard, organization is essential for that dialectical work. The other point that I wanted to raise that touches on some of the things that Eddie and Noah were saying is that while trade union consciousness is absolutely important, there are also very significant limitations to trade union consciousness. And that's one of the reasons that I don't think that trade unionism is the vanguard that is going to save us. We need to take things to a higher level. The history of trade unionism has been a history of the struggle of labor against capital and has helped the working classes gain very important things in that struggle that should be supported and advanced, right? There's also the risk and the reality of the fact that in the history of trade unionism, you also have those unions and those people involved in unions who are willing to make class compromises because the end game is to improve the living conditions of them as individual workers or them as a group of workers in, for instance, a particular nation state or a particular region, not the overthrow of the capitalist system. Therefore, the higher level of vanguardism that I think is necessary is party level vanguardism, in which trade unionism plays an essential role, but you move to the level not just of organizing labor against capital, but you move to the level of organizing labor in order to overthrow capitalism. And so to echo some of the things that were being said earlier, yes, absolutely, let's support, not only support, but be involved in the union struggles that are going on, but let's connect those to a higher level of the overthrow of the capitalist system. Otherwise, we're just going to be constantly begging for more scraps from the capitalists. Let's get rid of them. Therefore, we wouldn't have to continue to beg for more or fight for more because the system itself has changed.
I also, just real quick, want to wonder just aloud how important trade unionism itself is in our era, with so few trade unions, so few industries and productive industries in the US. I think we may see more forms of economic rent organization, of debt strikes and things of that nature. And I think organizing along those lines, especially in coordination with the Vanguard Party, which I want to be clear, though it does sort of come into being as a vanguard, I am absolutely also interested in building. I think something like that, being able to coordinate directly against finance like that, would be very effective in our era.
Yeah, this is all again absolutely fascinating. And if I just can make a couple of points, I think again, Noah, something that you said, and then I want to connect it with something Gabriel said. You said something about needing things done, right? And I think that actually we are now living through a time, particularly in what I consider the most neoliberal financialized economies, such as the US and the UK, a level of breakdown of the system, which is really coming to the point where actually a lot of things need to be done, which capital and a capitalist state is unable to do. And, one way of thinking about revolution, revolutions are not planned or plotted, as in the lurid imagination of the right, that, sort of 5 people sitting beneath a bare light bulb plotting and planning a revolution. That's not how it happens. Revolutions happen. And I think revolutions happen when people make some of the most often limited demands. I mean, think of peace, bread, and land. Like, what was so revolutionary about that? But they seem to make some what they consider to be very minimal demands, and the system is either unwilling or unable to fulfill them. And the people say, all right, we're going to do this ourselves. And that's what a revolution is. And I think that, the time is fast coming when the collapse of the system is going to require a lot to be done, I would say, personally. Because, so then the second thing is that, to me, again, I don't claim to have all the answers. I think you guys are right to point out that it's really a difficult question, how exactly to organize and so on. But there are some parameters that are absolutely true. For instance, as some of you were saying, like, you have to go beyond mere trade unionism to a higher level. Absolutely. And that higher level is not doesn't arise abstractly in the minds of certain intellectuals, etc. It arises from the actual practices. And how will it arise? It arises because people are constantly talking to one another, saying, okay, we are doing this here, what are you doing there, etc. And which is why I often think of the immense amount of time that the Marxists of the classical era, and that includes Marx and Engels, but also people like Lenin, actually spent just corresponding with people elsewhere, trying to figure out what was happening elsewhere. I think, and this is much easier for us today. In those days, they wrote a letter and then waited for 5 days before they got a response, or whatever, 10 days, whatever. So, and so obviously that kind of networking correspondence is very important. But there is another thing, which is that increasingly we live, and particularly after COVID, we have become even more individualized. We all live in our cocoons. We'll sit in front of our screens. I'm sure that there is some utility to it, but I think unless and until you create actual living communities, and there, different struggles combine. In the old working class communities of the past, which did achieve a fair bit in Western countries without actually achieving revolution, but they achieved a fair bit. it was not just about wages, it was about working conditions, it was about mutual self-help, it was about, rent and housing and whatnot, all these things. And I think that you have to have all of those things, but ultimately there is no politics without an ideology, that is to say, a common way of thinking. And there is no ideology without a community where people actually feel they belong together. And I think that and I know the old forms of community are falling away very fast, but unless we build something new, a new form of community, I don't think we're going to get a politics. Otherwise, we're just going to get collectivism and stuff like that.
I just wanted to come in and sort of invert Noah's question and Gabriel's question. Like, should we expect the next round of struggle to come out of trade unionism? Well, I don't know. The German Revolution of 1918 was organized by the trade unions. You read Richard Müller's history of the German Revolution, the November Revolution, it's absolutely clear. He himself was a trade union leader. There was a revolutionary movement of the shop stewards in Germany, which coincided with the emergence of the USPD and the Luxemburgist Liebknechtist current. But the actual revolution itself was done by the damn trade unions. So you can't, the general point I take to be true, but there used to be a rule idea we discussed in my tradition, which is, if you think of the three things that might happen, history always throws up a fourth, right? Or as Hegel would put it, the owl of Minerva flies only at night, or whatever. The reality, my friend, is green. Theory is grey. You cannot foresee. There is a tremendous tradition. I just look at historical tradition. Radhika has done a lot to explain to people the importance of the historical approach. Not just generalities, but specificities. Seems to me there have been huge moments in American history when the trade union movement has played a very key role. And there are other forms of mass struggle. So, for example, I think the formation of the CIO was clearly a transformative event that rose out of class struggle, and it overthrew the old domination of the craft unions, which is a crucial moment in the formation of a general working class consciousness. I think that the Black Muslim movement and the Black Panthers played a formative role. And I think that Malcolm X was a formative vanguard leader with tremendous, that's why he was killed. That's why the American method of dealing with vanguards is to assassinate them. Okay, so who's good by who gets assassinated in general is a good rule of thumb, right? On the other hand, you had mass struggles like the peace movement. I think that the anti-Vietnam War movement, that was a huge movement. No one could have predicted that would have been the form that a mass movement would take. You had the civil rights struggle. You have one of the most successful movements against nuclear armaments that I've ever heard of, which is Women's Strike for Peace in 1953. It actually stopped nuclear testing as an incredible feat that we, our children owe so much to today, because, you're not dying of the strontium-90 fallout in your food. That was what everybody was getting in the 1950s. So and they organized through telephone trees of all things, right? So you can't predict the form that a mass movement will take. What you have to be able to do, the Bolsheviks were expert at this, is to know what's going on. And the way in which Pravda was created, Iskra was created, I think was absolutely excellent. It said, our task is to report the experience of workers everywhere in Russia, whatever that is. So, and Lenin had this marvelous phrase that every central committee must contain a thief. Why must every central committee contain a thief? Because we are aspiring to power, and therefore we have to know what's happening in all classes of society. So we have to know what the thieves think in order that we can deal with the issues that thieves raise. That's my concept of a vanguard party, is taking on from what Gabriel says about organic intellectuals, which draws on the whole experience of all struggles, of all working people, and seeks to express their common interest in such a way that hundreds of millions of people are drawn in. That's a huge task. I mean, we're trying to go from tens of thousands to hundreds of millions. That's not going to happen by effort of will. It's something that will be created historically. And to me, what's most important of all is to be alive to the possibilities of every struggle and not to stand outside it and diss it, which is why I think the Purity Fetish is such an excellent excellent way of talking about it. You know, when the Greenham Common anti-cruise missile movement started in Britain, which could have changed the course of history if it had prevented cruise missiles, the far left organizations stood outside and said, "Why aren't you talking about workers?" I mean, for Christ's sake, right? You know, it's insane. This was a mass women's movement for peace, right? And you had to support it unconditionally without demanding that it goes and supports workers' struggles. The same applies to workers' struggles. You have to unconditionally support them without demanding that they meet a whole set of criteria, like being, you know, fully political aware. I'm not saying that's what Gabriel's saying. I'm just trying to, you know, expound the way that one approaches mass struggles. You have to take mass struggles at the point where they are. The vanguard is then that section of those mass struggles that understand its relations to other mass struggles. That's what a vanguard is. As the Communist Manifesto says, the Communist Party has no special policy and distinction for other parties, save that it represents the most general interest of the working class, as opposed to the interest of any particular section. Well, yeah, the working class includes many people who don't have jobs. In fact, most people in the working class don't have jobs, right? So they're going to engage in all kinds of struggles that have nothing to do with trade unionism. On the other hand, there's going to be trade union struggles, which cannot be ignored by the people who think, you know, that the bourgeoisie tries to split off from the organized working class by saying working class, organized working class, privileged class, craft organizations, you know, fuck them, join Trump, right? So this is a bit incoherent, but the point is that it's the vanguard is the people who understands the common interests of all forms of mass struggle, whatever they may be.
I think one thing I want to mention, the Communist Party, USA, it is basically the one that built the CIO. 9 out of 11 of those unions were red unions. And it made me think of, when you brought that up, the union bashing that went on, right? The union breaking. And I wonder if we'll face something like that as this new wave of unionizations happens. So I know we've been on this sort of vanguard topic for a while, but if you guys want to change directions, I think anticipating the moves of the class enemy might be an interesting place to go next. Now, don't get me wrong, stay on this topic if you want. I just thought I would bring it up.
I wanted to piggyback off of something that Radhika was mentioning about building community and the connection of building community to being able to achieve a certain level of ideological clarity. And I think that's very important. And one of the contemporary places where a lot of community building is done, somewhat unfortunately, perhaps somewhat fortunately, is the internet. And we've seen that there's an immense level of manipulation that the ruling class can do in that sphere, because it literally owns everything, not just the specific social medias, which can use bots to promote certain narratives, use censorship to diminish others, to shadow ban others, or to even ban others. You know, one of the things we mention often, because it's hit us fairly hard, is that TikTok, the most popular app in the country, our accounts have been banned 7 times now. seven bans, and some accounts have gotten close to 400,000 followers. We're getting millions of views with a certain level of consistency, and that affected our ability to create both community and ideological clarity at that level, at that scale. So how should we think about approaching those questions in an era where so much of that community building, of that war of positions, has to be waged in these ideological terrains that are associated with social media, with the internet, and where any success that you have, once it begins to grow into something that could be substantial in opposing the existing order, you can get the rug pulled under you. Because I mean, I was talking to Noah a while back, and even if you do create your own alternative places, people would find them through search engines that are still controlled by the Silicon Valley bourgeoisie, and that can still prevent you from finding those places, because certain libertarian voices have promoted alternatives to like YouTube or to Twitter, where people wouldn't be banned, but they would. You look those up, and they don't sometimes come up on Google search engines, and so there's so many infinite ways of manipulating the creation of community and the the war of position that we have to engage in necessarily in this day and age of after the technological revolution of the last like 2 decades. So how do you guys face that problem?
Do you mind if I say something quick too? Just because that's kind of been, we've been waging that struggle on TikTok and on social media and stuff. And I think Noah and I have learned a lot this week from managing our Discord server. Like, one of the best things you can do, and this is really hard for people who don't use these social media platforms in their everyday life, but one of the best things you can do is understand the platform. Like, even our book launch today, there's a libertarian professor doing a live stream where they are trying to send people to disrupt our stream and get our stream taken down. So in the course of this book launch, I've been researching what I can do about it, and I've set our chat to subscriber only. So you have to be subscribed to Midwestern Marx for 10 minutes before you can leave a chat. So that's basically canceled out all of these libertarians, except for the ones who are really, really dedicated to trolling. But same with Discord. It was a long process and it took a lot of effort, but we were able to organize a mod staff of people who are theoretically educated and active on the app, and kind of who are going to run our Discord server in this community of Midwestern Marx followers, in a way that is organized and is helping people develop theoretically. And like Noah and I kind of had to learn how to use Discord. So I think taking those realms of struggle seriously as real places where people are getting organized and people are learning theory and learning how to use them is key. Like, learning the platforms themselves, like, it has been really helpful for us. And then just being relentless, like constantly putting stuff out, even no matter how many times they take us down too. But
it was definitely a learning process for us.
Huge learning experience.
I'm sort of forever amazed at the ability of wrecking and childishness of a lot of the sort of purity fetish milieu. But what I think, one, it's in a better place now, and we learn and we improve. But I think at the end of the day, if we're talking about the internet in general and organizing in general, there's going to have to be done something at the level of the property question on big internet questions, right? So Google, YouTube, Facebook, all of these, we're going to at some point need our people in there. There was one thing that Trotsky did that I respect, and it was right before the seizure of power. He wanted people in each of the economically important zones so that when things went down, their people were there that they could trust, that could sort of as quickly as possible and as bloodlessly as possible change over the ownership, right? And I think we need some sort of internet version of that, right? Like, why don't we have people working at Google? Why don't we have people working at Twitter? Just stuff like that, I think. And for that, you need an organization that is serious and able to have its own cadre of professional revolutionaries who can be sent out on these tasks.
And the last thing really quick, the ruling class takes it serious. Like, there are NATO operatives who are running TikTok now. They've been hired on to TikTok's content moderation staff, and same with Twitter. We've seen the recent Twitter files debacle. The FBI pressuring Zuckerberg to censor information around the election. Like, the ruling class takes these, technological platforms serious. So I think we should too.
Just real quick on Twitter, it's funny how they always talk about Chinese censorship. Yet when TikTok was run by the Chinese, Midwestern Marx wasn't getting banned.
It was a way better app when China was in control.
Yeah. Well, that raises a really important question, right, about the relationship between tactics and strategy, because I think you are a lot more savvy than I am about online culture. And so the tactics that you're developing, please continue developing them, write manuals, share them, help others of us learn about them. But I have similar experiences at the level of what I would call more generally the bourgeois cultural apparatus, which is the entire system of production, circulation, and consumption of ideas and culture. And so I'm faced more on a daily level with where I can publish, where I can't publish, where I can speak, where I can't speak. And these issues of censorship are constant. And I know those types of tactics more concretely, such as a Trojan horse tactic. I could potentially write something in the New York Times, but I have to do it in such a way that I can get it through their censors, right? But that also means that then I'm restricted. Basically, I can increase my reach, but then I decrease what I can actually say. And finding out how and when to do that, and those tactical issues are so fundamentally important, but we can't de-link them from strategy. And the strategy, I think, at least some of you alluded to, is we need to seize the means of communication. We need to be able to own and control them. And this explains a lot about why certain countries are labeled as authoritarian when they want the freedom of self-determination regarding their cultural apparatus. They wanted to develop their own socialist cultural apparatus that is in the hands of the people, and more specifically, the working class. And so the critiques of authoritarianism that are launched against China for restricting, honestly, at a kind of, the great firewall, you can go with a VPN and get around it. So it's not as if it's as draconian or as authoritarian even as people would imagine. But you can understand why an organization that regularly contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency, Google, Amazon, etc., why they would want to keep those platforms out. And so I think we need to struggle both at the tactical level, but always keep our eye on the strategy. And that is that socialism would mean that Eddie and Noah spend a lot less time, and all the rest of you, trying to get back on TikTok, trying to keep your shit actually out there, because that tactical battle is going to be endless. So let's learn how and continue to fight those tactical battles, but keep the strategy in clear focus.
I think one of the things we should remember is most of the socialist movements of the 19th century, the ones who actually conducted revolutions, were essentially grew under conditions of massive censorship. So, and they managed it, right? The Bolshevik Party was never operated under anything else. The German anti-socialist laws were the main object on which people actually struggled for a long time. And by the time they were repealed, there was already a mass socialist organization in existence. So we could go back. I mean, this historical approach means you actually go back and read history, see what people did. It's very interesting. You read Lenin's famous imperialism, highest stage of capitalism, call it what you want. There's a beginning chapter where he describes all the things he couldn't say. He says, I couldn't mention this, I couldn't mention that, I couldn't mention the other. So censorship is always partial, complicated, difficult, but there are ways around it. So that's my first thing. I mean, for example, Telegram or CGTN simply means you bypass your own nation's system of suppression and engage in somebody else's system. I mean, there's not much actual suppression in Telegram, and the only thing you can't say in China is against the constitutional position of the Communist Party. You can say more or less anything else you want. It's much freer than that, including in Russia, by the way, much freer than what you find in the US or in my experience, Canada or whatever. But the other thing is that I think there's a difference between reaching people and organizing people. I mean, this is where mass organizations come into being. If you have a union, if you have a peace organization, if you have something that they really can't stop you talking amongst yourselves short of fascism. I mean, fascism is a real probably the main danger, in my opinion, much more dangerous than censorship. And it's coming to a country near you. That's what the Ukrainian government is there for, is to organize everybody to support world fascism, right? And they're doing quite well, not in terms of the military war, but in terms of changing the ideological climate. Things like VE Day is no longer called VE Day. It's called Europe Day. Europe? What? Germany Day? Think about the rewriting of history that's going on in that. So fascism is much more dangerous than censorship, because censorship doesn't kill you, right? Fascism does. But there are ways of dealing with censorship, which to me, the key difference is the difference between organizing and reaching. So sometimes you have to find one way of organizing. And if you've got mass organizations within those, you can organize, and other ways of reaching. That's the way I look at it. And there's 100 ways you can reach people. So I'm less pessimistic about censorship than I am about fascism. I'm very pessimistic about fascism.
I just wanted to add, without at all negating anything Alan said or Gabriel said, all of which I entirely agree with. But I wanted to add that, the countries that are called authoritarian are not called authoritarian just because they restrict communication. They are called authoritarian because they restrict the right to property in various ways. They restrict the freedoms of capital in various ways. So, for example, while there may be, we've already agreed that there is in many ways more substantial freedom of expression in China than there is here, effectively. But take Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is called authoritarian even though day and night, all the television channels, which are still owned by the Don bourgeoisie, the big bourgeoisie of Venezuela, spew venom at the Bolivarian government and all its actions. So this is going on. Venezuelans are not restricting the freedom of speech, but they are, in the effort to develop their country, they have to restrict many of the, and in fact they have bent over backwards to try not to restrict it, and they've only restricted the freedoms of capital when their hand has been largely forced. But that's the thing, capital does not give you development, which is why you have to restrict its freedoms. In the old days, the word tyranny comes from the fact that back in the days of ancient Rome, there were regular revolts against the creditors, and then when these revolts brought certain rulers to power who essentially had to restrict the power of creditors, in fact, they were called tyrants anyway, and the word tyrant acquired a negative meaning or negative connotation. So anyway.
And it was so funny because this was taking place, I think, while I was in my senior year, where just a clownish show of Juan Guaido being pitched as the real president of Venezuela, and then Maduro as his authoritarian. But when Guaido would go to popular neighborhoods, the people would like throw chairs at him. You remember those? They were hilarious. There was just people throwing chairs and tables and who was helping Guaido not get like killed by the masses? It was the Bolivarian polices. The fact that it's so authoritarian. That's why the opposition leader, that's like basically funded by the main imperialist force that's trying to overthrow the.
Not basically funded. He is funded.
It's funded, yeah, funded by the main imperialist force trying to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution can still somehow around. I would say the critique would be perhaps they don't go far enough in their authoritarianism. But I think that the question of online. Sorry, I was going to switch to another topic. So
let me just say this is an actual graph of Venezuela's media right here. I believe one of these is the state-owned media, and like 75% of their media is privately owned and anti-revolutionary. And this is a little bit outdated, but it remains very similar to this day. So, I mean, the answer a lot of people say is for Venezuela to seize the means of communication, and which of course the West would decry as authoritarianism.
Just real quick, whenever someone talks about the authoritarianism of Venezuela to me, I mentioned that the media is mostly right-wing opposition to the Bolivarian Revolution. And look what our country did to Julian Assange. Look what it's doing to Matt Taibbi right now for the Twitter files,
Or, just Omeri Yeshiteli and the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement, simply for challenging the narratives of this proxy war against Russia. But I was going to say, in the question of social media, the sort of principle that I see at play is something similar to the discussion that we were having before of the relationship of trade and social movements to a vanguard party, which is necessary but not sufficient. In each case, these things are absolutely necessary. Our involvement in them are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient. If you have everyone who has a Twitter account, subscribed to Midwestern Marx or something and agree to socialism, you won't have a revolution. You still have to do something outside of online, right? It's not sufficient in the sense that you have to do something more, even if it's necessary. And as far as the fascist danger, there is an incredible fascist danger. For some reason, I still have this picture here of this UN vote. This was a vote from last year, I believe, on a draft for combating the glorification of Nazism, neo-Nazism, and other practices that contribute to racism and bigotry. And I believe, if I recall correctly, it was 62 countries that voted against this, so that are perfectly fine with glorifying Nazism. And that number had changed from just 2 the year before. And what's interesting is that the same year that the U.S. voted against this bill that would have prohibited the combating of Nazism, combating the glorification of Nazism, it voted in favor. It passed it passed a resolution in favor of condemning the horrors of socialism. So it's fine to glorify Nazism, but we must condemn the horrors of socialism. But I think part of the paradox is that there's a fascist threat today, objectively as bad as have ever had. Maybe not as bad, but it's getting up there. But a lot of the people using that language of fascist threat are using it in such a topsy-turvy manner to legitimize supporting the forces that have been fueling the real fascist threat. And I mean concretely, the fascist threat comes simply from Trump. To defeat that fascist threat, you have to vote for Biden. And that ignores the whole context of fascism, being something much deeper. I recommend the work of Gabriel Rockhill on, now you see me, now you don't. That sort of relationship of fascism to capitalism. And, we're talking about a party that has sent $150 billion to Nazis. And we have certain communist organizations talking about combating a fascist threat by supporting a party that has given billions, hundreds of billions to Nazis. So it's such a topsy-turvy arrangement where the ones fighting fascism or Nazism, I think what's going on in Ukraine, it's Nazism, are the ones that are labeled themselves fascists and Nazis. So how do you traverse those sorts of contradictions?
I just want to be real quick yet again here and interject that I think the reason they genuinely think voting for Biden is going to help fight what they call the fascist threat, right? Because somewhere in the last period of our history, they lost Marxism. Marxism got hidden somewhere, and they don't have a materialist view of what fascism is. So for them, fascism is just all the mean rhetoric of Trump. It isn't a sort of development of bourgeois oppression based on the inherent contradictions of capitalism developing to a point where they go into crisis, and we're not there to sort of create something new, right? And so for them, fascism is just an idea. It's, extra conservatism rather than this more materialist understanding.
I think that's a really good point, Noah, because the bourgeois concept of fascism tends to predominate, and that is that it's a bad way of thinking, someone without a moral compass, someone who traffics in the politics of hate, etc. And what is lacking is a materialist analysis of how fascism has always historically been a mode of capitalist governance, and that mode of governance has taken on different forms, been called different things, but it basically mobilizes the full force of the state and parastate militias and vigilante actors in order to impose or intensify capitalist social relations by any means necessary. And in that regard, one of the things to echo back, and good, Carlos is back with us now, is Carlos's important point about what it means to struggle against fascism within the imperial core is quite different than in other contexts, particularly in the US, because the ruling class agrees on two fundamentals, capitalism and imperialism, which are basically one fundamental at the end of the day. And so within the imperialist core, what you have is a bourgeois conception of fascism that tries to label one imperialist party as fascist and the other as not, which of course creates a lot of confusion. And for anyone who is paying attention with the Biden administration, here we have a Democratic administration, like former Democratic administrations, that have pursued the imperialist line of supporting fascist forces around the world. Right? And there's a million other examples that we could point to in this regard. So one of the elements I think that's really essential to the struggle against fascism, because it is very much one of the most pressing issues of the day, is to recognize that imperialist countries like the United States have systematically relied on fascist forms of violence in order to prop up and perpetuate the empire. And they also do that domestically through their police forces and through organizations like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, etc. And so if we want to be serious about fighting fascism, don't fall for the bourgeois conception of fascism that just paints a particular pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist candidate as somehow saving us from fascism. Get seriously about fighting it and go to the root of the cause. And I'll cite the great slogan, if I can remember it correctly, right? Fascism is the symptom, capitalism is the disease, right? And that's the disease that we have to diagnose. Socialism, though, is the solution.
Yeah, Georgy Dimitrov, right? He is the guy on fascism, by the way, and he describes it as the open terroristic dictatorship of the most chauvinistic elements of finance capital. And then he sort of adds that the apparatchiks attached to that, right? And I think what they seem to miss is the same thing they always miss, and it always brings me back to that quote by Engels again, right? What these gentlemen lack is dialectics, in that they can't see that what is the most chauvinistic at any point in time is going to look different, right? What is the most chauvinistic in our time contains what Gabriel was just saying, the Proud Boys, who aren't a racist organization like the KKK was, in what we could actually call an embryonic fascism, fighting against Reconstruction, right? And so we have to be able to think about the essence of fascism as opposed to the particular form it takes.
Well, I think there's a number of things. I mean, I lived through a series of 5 racist murders in Greenwich, which were organised by a fascist party. It was a physical force wing of the British National Party, calling itself the British. Can't remember what they called themselves, British Socialist Idiots or something like that. But they had a bookshop and they organised gangs of kids come off the working class estates and kill black kids. That's what they did. And anybody who has never had to comfort the parent of a child who is killed by them doesn't know what fascism is. And then anybody who's ever had, if you want to know what fascism is, it's you've organized a meeting and a bunch of thugs come in, pick up chairs, pick up baseball bats, and injure as many people as they can in the most brutal way possible. That's how you recognize fascism. I think there are other ways too, because it's based on racial superiority, which is a very important element of fascism. So I would say Steve Bannon is a fascist. There's no question about it. He's a conscious, organized, ideological fascist. He's got a very clear program, which is based on, the racial superiority of white people worldwide, reinforced by imperialism anywhere outside the US and so on. I think Trump is a demagogue. I mean, I don't see Trump as a fascist. At the same time, the fascism does take organized forms. I think the trucker convoy was a fascistic initiative. It was inspired by the ideology of the Bannonites, and I have no truck, quote unquote, haha, with people who think that the trucker convoy was something that one needed to dialogue with. I don't think that's true. You don't dialogue with fascists. You smash them. And in the process of smashing them, you get across to the people who've been duped by them that they're in the wrong organization. And, I'm not Antifa or anything like that. I don't mean you just get up with your own clubs. I mean, you dismantle them in the sort of ways that some people did respond to the trucker convoy, by getting street street organizations to go out and demonstrate against the truckers, which was beginning to happen towards the end of the trucker convoy. But Bannon and the Ukrainian right bloc, and now the Ukrainian government itself, are ideological and organizational fascists. If anybody looked at the debate that we organized with a number of Russians speaking about the situation in Ukraine, I would urge you to read and listen to what Said Gafurov says. He says, in Ukraine, you have a civil war. It's a civil war. It's not a war. And the civil war began because the working class polarized between those who are primarily low working class and could be labeled as Russian and therefore anti-Ukrainian, and an organization of essentially, lumpenized capital lumpenized workers in association with finance capital. And he gives a very telling point. He says the first act of the government was to dissolve the Constitutional Court. Now, immediately somebody starts talking about dissolving constitutional courts. You're talking about Schmittism, you're talking about facts on the ground, boots on the ground, and so on. And it's gone downhill ever since. I mean, just to give one example, there's now only one organization that you can belong to if you're under 16. There's only one youth organization, which is, it's just like the Hitler Youth. You want to see the song. Kids are taught to educate the Nazi salute, and it's glorified. They wear armbands. There as a completely new version of history being preached, which is, I commented the other day when we were going through a restaurant, and there's the Slava Ukraini sign on the door, right? This is translated in the English as stand up for Ukraine. Slava Ukraini does not mean stand up for Ukraine. It means glory to Ukraine. That's a kind of nationalism we have nothing to do with, right? It's not a struggle. It's not a liberation slogan. It's not freedom. It's not stand up for. It's we are superior to you. That's fascism, right? And it's same as imperialism and so on. So I think that the critique I would make of sort of Trumpism and Trumpite movements is not that they are fascist, but that they give credence to fascists, genuine fascists, which they shouldn't. The demand one might make with Trump, I mean, it's over now, but is break with Bannon, right? Break with movements that are overtly fascist. So I think that one needs a very concrete analysis, but fascism is a reality. It does exist. It's a growing threat, I think, essentially because imperialism is in such a desperate state that it now knows it can only rule by means of fascism. That was the meaning for me of the Maidan coup. You had to put a fascist government in power and then use that as a basis to organize, sort of worldwide fascist movement. So one has to be very concrete, but not to underestimate the danger, and not to. I agree with everybody who says don't label something that is not fascist as fascist, because that just opens the door to vote saying we got to vote for the liberals because they'll stop fascism. 99% of the time, it's the liberals who get the fascists in. Right? That's what happened in Germany. So that's no way to stop fascism. The way to stop is a sort of surgical separation of the real fascists from the people who merely flirt with it and use the sort of demagogic language, or do really bad things like attacking immigrants and so on. But separate the two. Sorry, I'm rambling again.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is that this is something that I'm glad we're discussing this, and I'm sure we are going to wind down very soon because we've been going for a while. But let me just say, first of all, that when people think of fascism today, the thing that dominates the imagination is the Holocaust. People forget that even before the Holocaust, fascism was fascism. Okay, that's the first thing. Secondly, fascism never comes to power without the cooperation of garden variety capitalists. Only they bring fascism to power. They have regularly brought fascism to power. When Hitler and Mussolini first took power, capitalist classes across Europe and North America were supporting them in one way or the other, overtly, covertly, whatever. Apparently, I was reading somewhere that Hitler was inspired in writing his Mein Kampf and all his anti-Semitic rubbish by a book by Henry Ford. So I think that, so that's the second thing. The third thing is that after having very reluctantly been forced to fight fascism, the capitalist powers then were in the forefront of preserving many fascist forces in power in post-war Western Europe. I think that's another thing we have forgotten. They also played a very big role in whitewashing the history of fascism. At the end of the Second World War, the mass understanding in Europe was that fascism was the product of capitalism. But over the course of the next many decades, that intimate link was loosened. Fascism was then connected with socialism, and all of this rubbish was told, including by people who many leftists call leftist intellectuals like Hannah Arendt and whatever not. And the fact of the matter is that this has completely dulled our understanding of fascism. So that's one set of points. So, and today we have capitalism in even greater decay and disorganization, and we should not at all be surprised if it takes recourse to fascism. I don't know. I'm not sure I entirely agree with Alan about Trump, because I think there are two critical, there are many forms of what Pulanzas call exceptional bourgeois rule. That's assuming that parliamentary representative democracy is the normal form of bourgeois rule. Then you have exceptional forms. They can take the form of military dictatorships, but they can also take the form of fascism. How is fascism different from garden variety dictatorship? Because dictatorship in any case violates the rule of law. Okay, so the rule of law is already gone out. But the additional element that fascism brings is the mobilization of para-state forces, the black shirts and the brown shirt variety. Why are they mobilized? Because the ordinary repressive apparatus of the state is not enough, or is not considered to be enough, to keep the working class in their place, keep the mass of the people in their place. The working class is the mass of the people. And so you deploy these, as I say, either because they're objectively necessary or not. Another reason why people say, we can't have fascism today because the working class is not strong. It doesn't matter if the working class is not strong. Maybe the bourgeoisie requires a level of repression of the working class that is even greater today than in the past. So, and because you see, with Trump, you have organizations like the Proud Boys. These are incipient organizations of this sort. And I think that such organizations are coming into existence in a variety of ways. And then finally, I just wanted to endorse everything that Alan was saying. The fact of the matter is there are international dimensions to fascism, and the fact that major capitalist powers are openly allying with a fascist regime in Ukraine tells you something. It tells you that they, this is what they need today to consolidate their power.
1000%, Radhika. I want to make a couple quick comments because Radhika is right in one other thing, that we have been going for almost 3 hours now, so we're going to wind down here soon. But I want to say that oh my God, I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. Oh, Trump did break with Bannon, by the way. So I'm not entirely in agreement either with you, Alan. There are parts of what you're saying that I do agree with, but I think in the US, fascism is going to take a very modern American form if it forms, right? And this includes globalization. And my real focus on this is that who is really behind the Ukrainian neo-Nazi coup government? It is our ruling class. And this relationship, I think, is key to understanding what could happen here. And I also think the relationship between the Democrats and Republicans will be part of that, and the continuation of the propaganda machine turning working class people against each other. And I think it will take a new, more modern form that incorporates that sort of thing, if it is to arise. And now, see, me, I'm a terminal optimist, and I would think we can fight it, and we fight it every day. And I think as time goes on, our side, this sort of new overcoming of the old left, or the new left, actually, is just getting stronger and stronger. And so, with that being said, I just want to ask if if anyone has any last remarks they want to make.
I just wanted to make one thing clear, because there's been some discourse in the comments about people from the trucker movement who might have participated. I'm absolutely not against discussing with them. Absolutely not against it. What I'm against is supporting them or joining them, which is a different matter. When the truckers came to Winnipeg, I went straight down there. I went and talked to them. That's what you do with any movement. The only way you can find out what a movement is about is go and talk to the people. And I was a bit careful what I said, because some of them were quite big and they had American flags. When anybody's carrying a giant American flag on Canadian soil, you have to worry. But nevertheless, I said, what do you think? You find out what people think. So and you can't defeat a movement unless you can debate with it, however bad it is, So I'm absolutely not against talking to people. I'm not against any restriction of speech and discourse and dialogue. What I'm against is joining the truckers or supporting the truckers. That's what I'm against.
That was a useful clarification, I think.
One of the things we never discussed is this whole no platform for fascists debate, where I change my mind every week.
I think part of that discussion has to be done with the awareness that it's going to be very difficult to be correct, and that we have to be open to the different ideas that people are going to propose, because I think a lot of the time they're well-meaning. Especially in the debates going on within comrades. And if a thing fails, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who proposed the idea is like a traitor to the movement or something. Perhaps things just went south. So I think with the censorship question, at least, it has come to a moment, at least in the U.S., where censorship has to be pushed back against. Some people argue that maybe this can be done in a way to appeal to the mass of Americans in a way that appeals to like the First Amendment. Others say that we can do this in other ways, but these questions are not easily settled, and often what ends up being the correct route to take is only seen after the fact.
I think what you guys were just saying brings up something I think about quite a lot, and it brings everything back around to the purity fetish and it preventing people from meeting people where they are, right? Now, I wasn't near the trucker protest. I couldn't have gone there, but I would have if it were near me, just as Alan did, right? Because I know what my ideas are, and I'm not afraid to share them with those truckers, because I believe that when they are approached in the correct way, the mass of people there, rather than, the leaders, the working class people there, will like these ideas, All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up for the night. Does anyone have any last burning things they'd like to say before we go?
I would just like to say thanks to all our guests. And for real, I've learned so much from every one of you. Even when I was first starting out, Radhika's capital guides were hugely important for me. And Gabriel's stuff about the Frankfurt School was like really the last piece of the puzzle for me with I don't know, I don't want to say it like that because I'm not done learning, but it really helped put together what my principles were when it comes to politics and philosophy and economics. And Alan, your work's amazing and influential as well. So thank you all for being here. It's a great honor for us.
Absolutely. I just wanted
to say, thank you is the word. It's a phenomenal discussion. And, the mere fact that we're having this discussion coming from three, at least, different traditions is testimony to a degree of maturity, which I think is what's required.
I just wanted to say thanks to Carlos, thanks to everyone, of course, but thanks also to Carlos for writing a magnificent and very clear book. And I think that you really get, you tick so many boxes. Everybody's got to take the few hours it takes to read this book. And I think that so much will become clearer. So thank you very much.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. it's really all about Carlos and the Purity Fetish tonight. So other than that, I also want to say thank you to our guests. You guys are fantastic. Radhika, your economic work is actually one of the inspirations of the current theory I'm working on that I call reproletarianization. And so I don't want to go on and on about me. Who cares about me, right? So all that being said, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to the Critical Theory Workshop and the International Manifesto Group, without whom this event would not have been possible and would have not have gone so well. And all three of you guys stick around after we go off air so we can, talk trash and swear and all that good stuff.
Thank you all again, and it's truly been an honor and a pleasure to discuss my book, the ideas, and other contemporary affairs with all of you.
All right. Everybody have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Bye.